Hey, are you Hillary?
That's me.
I think I'm your round 2 opponent.
You're Andy?
Yeah, that's me.
You're the one with that podcast.
Yeah, guilty as charged. That's my podcast.
It's about Cube?
Yeah, it's basically like a custom draft format. It's like the nerdiest way to play Magic, so, you know.
So you're the Cube man.
That's insane.
I
bet
still
Eric...
a quarter as much as if you had a Cube man. How much does Cube man weigh? About 1,000 pounds.
You keep saying the Cube man, and what if it was one person completely filling it?
I'm thinking it's like a fleshy colored cube, and it's full of meat, and maybe it has a happy face on it. Like we're comparing him with Air, right? He weighs 1,000 pounds. Even the old-timey Air was 250 pounds. That's still nothing compared to our buddy.
Cube man outweighs even the oldest Air.
Old Cube man. He helped me mentally picture the Air. I appreciate it.
Before we get into the episode, I want to let you all know that the Warhammer 40,000 set perspective survey is out. A couple people asked us if we were going to do a survey and a perspective and an episode and all that sort of rigmarole about this set. And the answer kind of comes down to how many people we get responses from. We'll probably publish the results no matter what. Will we spend a lot of time on the article if only 50 people respond? No, we'll probably just basically throw it up with a paragraph, summary, so the data is available. But if a lot of you respond, if this set proves interesting, then yeah, we'll do the stuff. We'll make an article for it.
I need you to give me the language to describe why I don't like the frames. I'm not enough of an artist to be able to describe that.
I believe what you're looking for is Uncanny Valley. It's the Uncanny Valley of Magic frames.
Yes.
I'll admit I haven't really dug into it yet, so I'll probably have to just pull up the survey and read through those cards myself.
They are very interesting. I will say there's not a ton of cards that appeal to me for my cubes. There is a couple hits for the Degenerate Micro Cube, which is always a joy. I just really enjoyed looking at the designs of the cards, just looking through the entire set. Even though I don't expect to play these in most contexts, just appreciating the work that clearly went into designing this set was a bit of a joy.
Yeah, there's a lot of heart going into this.
So do that. luckypaper.co/survey/40K. What's the set?
I believe, yeah, it's 40K.
Or just check out the show notes or our homepage. There'll be a banner where you can click to just fill out that survey.
And UNF is coming up next, probably. I don't know, in like 2 days.
Talk about cards I'm not reading.
We're truly in endless preview season.
Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, Supiter Superfan Maddox.
I love Supiter. Supiter is great.
Now, do you love it because it would destroy the entire Milky Way galaxy?
No, that's actually my least favorite feature of it.
Anthony, tell the good people what Supiter is.
Well, Supiter is the first example in XKCD's new What If 2 book, which I just find it so delightful. So, if you don't know, it's Randall Munroe. He's an internet cartoonist that makes cartoons about math and science and cool, fun stuff like that. And it's just so funny and so earnest and thoughtful and smart, and I love it so much.
To me, it's the perfect encapsulation of like the kind of curiosity I strive to have about the world, where he is curious about a thing and then figures out the objective scientific answer to it with all of his wit and knowledge, and then conveys it in a way that's very entertaining. Like he's my favorite like science communicator, I guess. So take that, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah, I mean, no comparison.
No comparison.
Sorry.
Don't apologize to him.
Okay, fair.
Anthony, for the second week in a row, we are not alone on this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We are joined once again by Parker, back-to-back episode Lamascus.
Hello. How are you all doing?
You tired of us yet, Parker?
I'm sick of you, but, I'm in it for the pension, not the ride along the way. So as long as
the
that
work
still
demands
happens.
your presence. Even if you don't want to be here, you have to be for the art. You need to be here to maintain the sanctity of your hard work.
Yes. Absolutely.
Parker, why don't you tell the people why you are joining us once again for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio?
Sure. So last week we did a set prospective, but this week we are doing a set retrospective. So Dominaria United heralded the standard rotation, and so it kicked out several sets from standard. And we thought we'd just take the opportunity to take a look back at those sets and to figure out how they fared in the Cube community. I mean, we've already been collecting data about people's impressions of a set before it comes out, but we wanted to conduct a study of, in the long run, how did it actually go? And so we've studied every set from Kaldheim to Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, and every set in between, including supplemental sets like Modern Horizons 2, and we've published a nice analysis with some amazing data visualizations that Anthony whipped up, and those are on the website, and so, yeah, we're excited to present that analysis.
And this is actually the second retrospective we've done. We should say that it's not really a set retrospective because we're actually covering all of the cards that rotated out of standard at the same time, so a big chunk of sets here. And this is kind of like, to me, the payoff, or one of the payoffs for doing our set prospectives, right, where we ask people for their opinions during spoiler season. Now we get to look and figure out, like, were people right, were they wrong, what were sort of the broad patterns amongst Cube designers in terms of which cards they over or underrated for their own individual environments. They thought they were going to continue playing, but they didn't, or vice versa. And we didn't actually record a podcast episode about the previous set retrospective, the previous standard rotation retrospective, and we got a lot of requests too, so that's why we are doing it now. This episode is not going to, cover all of the details of that article. I think it's much easier to read the article than it is to listen to us kind of read it on air. Also doesn't make for particularly interesting podcasts, so I would encourage everybody to go check out Parker's excellent article. A lot of time was spent on that, and it has all the details that we're not going to be able to go over very clearly here on the podcast itself. Instead, we're going to spend this episode talking about which cards the three of us personally over and underrated for all the sets that cycled out of standard this past month. I gotta say, gentlemen, very humbling to look back at my old ratings for cards from Kaldheim onward and see what I overlooked and what I thought was going to be great that is definitely nowhere near my cube anymore.
Yeah, you said that right. I feel the exact same way.
And actually humbling, not the way that a lot of people in the world use humbling now, where they say I did this great thing and everyone loved it. I'm so humbled. That's not what humbled means. You were not humbled.
One of the good things about this retrospective analysis is that we're not alone in being bad prophets of our own preferences. I think that really is one of the biggest takeaways for me of conducting these retrospectives is we're just really awful at looking at a set during preview season and correctly predicting which cards we will continue to like 2 years down the road.
On the other hand, I think maybe it's kind of encouraging to say, just try more things, even if you're not confident that, there's no real benefit to being right about what you're going to be enjoying 2 years from now, right? We just got to explore and try a bunch of stuff.
It's a great point.
Well, I think being aware of your own preferences and being able to select cards that suit your game design and, gameplay goals is definitely one of the skills of a cube designer. I think to some degree, there's definitely a reward for being good at that. It's also a great example, though, of how, you shouldn't overlook a card just because it maybe doesn't jump off the page at you, because you're going to be wrong so often, so much of the time.
For sure.
One of the overall trends we should definitely acknowledge is that if you look at the retrospective article that Parker wrote, and certainly looking at the results I have, at least for my own cubes here in front of me, for my own estimations, it is very common for lots of cards to be quote-unquote overrated. And we didn't... The language is not perfect here. We debated using the terms overrated or underrated in the article because it sounds so much like we're talking about power level, which of course we're not. We're just talking about overrated in terms of how much you're going to like it for your own environment. But whatever words make sense here, though, so many cards end up overrated, meaning people think they're going to like more cards than they end up actually liking, which makes sense, right? We're talking about spoiler season, we're looking at new cards, everyone's excited about them. I think people are more likely to be optimistic about cards that they want to work than pessimistic about cards that might end up not making the cut. The bigger factor, though, is that, when we were talking about Kaldheim, which was now at this point 2.5 years ago, I guess, or 1.5 years ago, whenever Kaldheim came out. I'm really bad at time these days. We're talking about Kaldheim. What my cube looked like when Kaldheim came out, there might have been cards I was really excited about playing that in the interim, the past 7 sets that have came out since Kaldheim just supplanted that and made my cube different enough that, sure, at the time, that card seemed like it was going to be in my cube for a long time, but then we got even more options that were more in line with my gameplay goals, and so those cards just got kind of pushed out by more recent stuff. So that is definitely a pattern, is we see people testing and more excited about way more cards that end up sticking around in their cube in the long term.
Yeah, another way to think about that, Andy, is since Call Time, there have been nearly 2,000 to 3,000 brand new Magic cards printed, which is like 9 or 10 cubes worth of cards if you're only starting from Call Time and not repeating any card. So like an incredible amount of new cards. And so the 30 that I tested from Call Time are competing for space, not just with the 360 in my cube, but the thousands that have been printed since then. And so most sets and most cards have this like attrition rate over time in terms of how much cube play they're seeing. And if a card doesn't have attrition, and if it is instead like increasing in play rate, that's usually a signal that something special is going on.
So I think we'll just start with, we're going to cover our most overrated cards, our most underrated cards, and then also there's a couple, predictions during spoiler season that I want to call out. It's just, we get some things right. We're going to talk a lot about the things we got wrong, but also there are some things that I'm proud to have gotten right, and I know the same is true for you too. So we'll cover those as well. I'm really only going to be talking about the Bun Magic Cube here. I have a couple of small mentions about the Degenerate Micro Cube. I've maintained other cubes over the past couple years, but I think jumping around between contexts is going to be too difficult, and the Bun Magic Cube is definitely the cube I've spent the most time curating, and I'm most likely to have had subsequent realizations about card power levels that I might have been off by in spoiler season. I'm going to start with the 5 cards from the standard rotation into 2022 that I overrated most, and number 5 is Turok Dread Cantor. I don't think we should read all the rules text for all these cards. It's going to be a lot of cards. You can find them all on the cards mentioned page, which we'll put in the show notes. It has a visual spoiler of all the cards we talk about in the episode in chronological order, so you can just follow along if any of these cards are cards you're not familiar with. And Turok was a card I was really excited about because of my, at the time, goals of really bolstering this black aggressive deck, and this seemed like a really good black aggressive card, and just because it seemed like a good raw power level. And the reasons that it has been cut, and also not something I would ever really go near my cube these days, is that I kind of got rid of that black aggressive deck, at least that mono black aggressive deck or heavily black aggressive deck. And more importantly, the protection from white, which I thought would be kind of irksome, ended up to, in testing, just be awful for me. The idea, it just kind of totally hosed mono white aggro decks in a couple of the games where it was in my cube for a brief period. And that kind of narrow hate and narrow hosing that is kind of out of the control of the player of the card is something I have avoided in the past and should have seen on this card and avoided outright at spoiler season.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that this is going to be a pattern that's going to come up a bunch is compared to the prospectus when we're looking at new cards and trying to evaluate them. I think what's going to come up a lot here is play patterns, and specifically how did this actually affect the context? Not just what did this card do, but what did it do to other cards in this context?
And also just the idea that my cube goals changed from what I expected them to be.
Right.
If I was still trying to maintain a cube with a very dedicated mono black aggro section, this card would probably still be in my cube and still be rated pretty highly. But I gave this a 2.8 at spoiler season. I cut it shortly after putting it in my cube, and I'm not going to go back to it because my goals have changed.
Was the sort of flavor of it and the obvious reference to a really well-known sort of part of Magic something that drew you into it initially?
Yeah, it's definitely a very cool card. It does reference an iconic card. It's a very cool effect, so that was definitely part of it. I think the card is overall very cool. And if it didn't have protection from white, I still might be dabbling with it just because it's got that flavor. But it's just not the play patterns I'm looking to cultivate, which I failed to realize when I was looking at it during spoiler season. My 4th most overrated card is kind of similar, but also kind of a totally different reason why it's been cut, and that's Agadeem's Awakening. This is the black mythic double-faced land from Zendikar Rising, and this card honestly would probably still be in my cube if not for the fact that Takenuma Abandoned Mire was printed in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which takes up that, slot. Again, I talk a lot on the show about how I don't like to think of my cube as having slots, and I'll just add and cut cards kind of regardless of how similar they are to other ones that are being added or cut at the same time. But in this case, I didn't want to have too many of these black utility lands that are oftentimes going to be played just as basics, but sometimes will have this late game value. And Takenuma Abandoned Mire just ended up being so much more in line with what Cube was doing than Agadeem's Awakening. So even though I think that card is still totally fine, I gave it a 3 at release. I was like, I'm super excited about this card. It's going to be in here for a long time. And it's just not because it got replaced by a much better card, which I couldn't have foreseen. I say better card, a better card for my Cube, which I couldn't have foreseen during spoiler season. So that's just an example of something new coming along later that just totally supplanted something that I was previously pretty excited about.
Yeah, I mean, that just goes back to what we were saying about how a lot of the ratings or a lot of the play rates have gone down from initial expectations just because, yeah, more and more cards are being printed. We're not really evaluating all of Magic previous plus this new set. There's also this chunk of cards on top of it that's going to replace things as well.
You know, Andy, I'm curious, do you think if your goals were to change again, like let's say you bump up your cube size to 384 or something, or maybe you decide, you know, that you want a larger proportion of your spells to be kind of main board, sideboard cards or something. Do you think if that's the case, you might see yourself on Agadeem's Awakening and Takenuma, and maybe like, is it Cabal Pit that's the threshold one? Would you ever go up to 2 or 3 lands in that quote-unquote slot if your goals were to change?
Yeah, I think I definitely would. I'm not that low on Agadeem's Awakening now. Like Turok I cut because the play patterns were something I really didn't want to have in my cube, and this card I think is perfectly fine. It does definitely get worse when I don't have the mono black or heavily black aggressive deck, so it was definitely a factor. Takenuma is much better as a, splash or second color because the actual black mana to channel it is much less committal than the black mana to cast Agadeem's Awakening. But yeah, I could definitely see a world where if I were to go to 540, I think this would definitely be in the list, whereas at 360 it just doesn't make the cut for me anymore. Number 3 is very similar. It's Turn Timber Symbiosis. That's the green Zendikar Rising, Modal Double-Faced Flip Land. Similar story here, except this was one of the ones, I also gave this a 3. I was really excited about this one as well, and I was really excited about pretty much all the cards in this cycle, to be honest. I'm still on Shatterskull Smashing, and I'm still on Emiria's Call, but Turn Timber Symbiosis ended up being, to my surprise, one of the least relevant of these lands in the actual playtesting of my cube. It seems on paper like it should be kind of perfect for any ramp deck to be able to have a land when you need a land, and then also have that land be a late game mana sink to turn into a big bomb later on. And frankly, it was just that the whiff rate was pretty high on it. I mean, it was already not cast as a spell that often. It was probably played as a land, I don't know, between 60 and 75% of the time, which on paper I'm fine with. Like, I'm fine with a card that is only has the exciting half or only does the cool thing, one in every 4 or 5 times. But when it only does it 1 every 4 or 5 times, and then half of those times it whiffs, essentially, that feels pretty bad. And so, like, this thing getting a mana dork, even though it puts 3+1/+1 counters on it, just felt pretty awful. And therefore, even if you have a chance to maybe, like, if you're looking at it in your hand, and if you, like, draw 1 or 2 more lands, you can actually cast it, or you can put it in play now and then maybe dump that mana into an activation of some ability or something. I found myself just being like, I don't even want to cast this unless it's my really, truly only option, because it's going to have such a high fail rate. So that one did not make the cut for me either. That one I do not see myself putting back in, Parker. If I was to go to a bigger cube size or find room for more non-basic utility lands, there's a lot I would play before I would come back to Turn Timber Symbiosis.
Is that something you think you could have evaluated differently, just doing a little math on that and, looking at some decks and seeing what the hit rate is? Or do you think it really
probably
just needs that play experience? Because, like, even things that maybe are technically hits aren't actually just going to be relevant during certain games, certain board states.
I think I definitely, if I had, like, sat down and, like, looked at a bunch of past deck lists that had been drafted from my cube and tried to figure out the ones I'd want to put this card in, and then done the hypergeometric calculations to figure out what the actual hit rate was going to be at different points in the game, I think I could have informed my evaluation better. Maybe I would have given it a 2 instead of a 3. I would have been like, I'm excited, but tentatively excited. I always think about cube design as this melding of science and math and, like, objectivity, and also, like, the subjectivity and, like, softer things you can't really measure. And one of those things is like, okay, how bad is it when you hit a mana dork? How bad is a 7 mana 4/4 that was otherwise a land, late in the game? And that's the kind of thing that you can run all the hypergeometric calculations you want, and you're not going to know how bad that fail rate is, right? Like, that's going to come down to all kinds of factors, like what your opponent's deck is doing, what the game state looks like. And so that's the kind of thing I feel like is much better informed by just feeling it, playing some games and seeing what it feels like to actually cast this thing and hit your ignoble hierarch or whatever, and only get that sort of 4/4 body in the late game. And it just felt pretty bad. In my cube, it just turned out there were enough things going on at that point in the game that you didn't want to have a expensive card that doesn't have a high payoff necessarily. All right, on to my top 2 overrated cards. So both Academy's Awakening and Turntimber Symbiosis, I rated a 3. So I gave it the highest possible rating, ended up cutting them in the intervening couple years. The number 2 card, I also gave a 3, but I think I rated even higher in my head than the Turntimber Symbiosis or Academy's Awakening, which is why I put it higher in this list. And that's Doomscar. This is the Foretell Wrath of God from Kaldheim. I was very high on this card. I believe, if I even may have said in our set review episode that I thought there was plenty of circumstances where this would be even better than actual Wrath of God in a cube context, because being able to foretell it and then cast it for the foretell cost and also follow it up with another spell on that turn where you cast the Wrath, essentially being able to double spell on your Wrath of God turn instead of having to give your opponent the first chance to start rebuilding their board would actually be a virtue, and having to Wrath by exactly turn 4 wasn't going to be as relevant in Singleton drafted environments compared to constructed. I ended up cutting this, not necessarily because the card was bad, though it did certainly underperform my expectations on power level, more because I actually found that my cube didn't want that many Wraths. I didn't actually need another board wipe in white for my control decks. I was kind of following the play the good cards heuristic rather than thinking about exactly how many board wipes my environment needed. And so a new good card came along, a card that matched my design goals that I thought would fit with the cubes in my environment. And so I added it. And what I found after drafting a few times with it and playing some games with it is that I just didn't need that many board wipes. There was a board wipe always just riding someone's sideboard because they already had a Balance and a Wrath of God, or they were, playing a blue-black control deck and they had access to Languish and Toxic Deluge, and they were not going to splash for a white Wrath. And so it just turned out to be a card that didn't really have space in my cube. And I'd be remiss not to mention the foretell thing. I know we talked about this a lot during spoiler season, where people were saying, oh, well, foretell is a cool mechanic, but you can't just run 1 or 2 foretell cards because your opponent will know what it is, and that is bad. And we really harped on the fact that it's not bad, right? Like, if the mechanic foretell just said, exile it face up instead of face down, it would functionally give you 95% of the advantages of the mechanic, which is getting to spread the payment of a card out over multiple turns. That's what the mechanic really does. The fact that it happens to be hidden information doesn't really affect gameplay too much, I think. And I still stand by that, but I will say it just kind of annoyed me to have 1 or 2 foretell cards in my cube, just because, I don't know, it is kind of a complicated mechanic, and it didn't feel like, certainly for an effect like a Wrath of God, even if I thought Doomscar and Wrath of God were kind of like a toss-up in terms of effectiveness or power level, I'm always going to take the clean Wrath of God over the sort of messy, complicated foretell Doomscar.
Yeah, I think also not just the context of the cube, but the context of who's playing it matters a lot there. And I feel like we've been fortunate to be playing with a lot of different people that are, it's a rotating group. And I think that's the worst situation when you have these kind of like hidden information, but it's not really hidden information when it's like, and also possibly the worst is when you have like literally 2 things with foretell, because someone who's familiar with the cube will be like, yes, you're playing this color. I know because of the kind of deck you're doing, it's got to be this card, but it is technically, there's some hidden information. So you don't just want to play the card face up. And it just makes it just a less accessible environment.
For my number 1 most overrated card, I'm cheating a little bit, and I've combined a few cards into one. My most overrated cards, I think, by far, were the Mardu Evoke Elementals from Modern Horizons 2. I'm talking Solitude, I'm talking Grief, I'm talking Fury. These were the only 3 I tested in my cube. I had included Subtlety in my survey, but rated it pretty low. I was not that enthusiastic about it, but I gave Solitude a 3, Fury a 2.9, and Grief a 2.8. These were all cards I was very excited about. And certainly, I think they would all be perfectly powerful enough to still see play in the Bud Magic Cube. The power level is not the reason that these didn't end up making the cut. It was just that, in the wise words of Anthony, who I saw, at some point in my cube have somebody evoke Solitude against him, he just said, that card is so dumb. And I was like, you know what? He's right. That card is dumb. It is pretty silly. These just ended up being play patterns I didn't like, which, on paper, I love modal effects. I love the fact that this card is castable in 2 different ways. And really, each of these kind of has different reasons why they didn't work out for me. Fury, which I think I did kind of predict this a little bit during spoiler season. I think I said I thought Fury was going to be the best of these cards in Singleton cubes, and I still maintain that it is. And I found that card was just straight up unbeatable if you were an aggro deck. Your opponent has it in their opening hand with another red card. You're just not going to win. They can continue to develop their board, and at any point for 0 mana, just, plague wind you. And you're never going to come back from that in a cube like mine where your aggro decks, any kind of drafted environment, your aggro decks are never going to be hyper consistent and hyper redundant. And so that was just devastating for any aggressive deck. So it was really too powerful, I think, in Fury's case. In Grief's case, I think it was honestly kind of not powerful enough, sort of. You very, very rarely ever wanted to evoke a Grief. It would be like very rare circumstances where maybe you were stuck on mana and you had a reanimate in hand and you're like, well, rather than do nothing for the next couple turns because I haven't drawn my lands, let me just use these cards I can't already cast to affect the board. Let me, evoke this Grief, then reanimate it, get 2 cards out of their hand, have a 3-power creature in play. But that was kind of like a fallback. Really, you were playing it as a 4-drop and discarding a card at 4 mana, not the most powerful thing in my environment at least. And then when those two got cut, I was like, Solitude is great and very powerful and maybe not as unfair as something like Fury, at least in my environment, but just for some of the reasons, those play patterns just weren't doing it for me. And I cut Solitude, I cut all of these cards not that long after Modern Horizons 2, probably within 4 or 5 months, I would guess, if I look back at it. And since then, I've become much more conscious of avoiding lifelink in my cube, and so if I was to look at Solitude now, I would say, let's avoid this for lifelink reasons, if not for anything else, just because that's something I've been low on in my cube lately. So this whole cycle was something I was excited about, and then the whole cycle has been cut from my cube. So that, I think, is a pretty bad overrating to think that this whole mechanic, this whole cycle, this whole play pattern was going to be something I was going to enjoy, and then just didn't do it. It felt too unfair in my environment, which is maybe hard to specify exactly why this feels more unfair to me than Force of Will, which has been my cube for a long time and I like quite a bit. But these just didn't feel like they were playing on the same axis as other cards, whether they were too powerful or not. It just didn't feel right.
It's interesting looking at the results from the community at large. The ratings on these this cycle of elementals have all gone in different directions. So Fury's gone way up, Subtlety's gone down. I wonder if that's a feature of... Do you think a lot of people test cycles in their entirety and then just make changes based on which ones they actually enjoy playing with or not?
I think based on the results of our surveys, we can say pretty confidently that most people don't test the whole cycle, because there were definitely... I think Endurance was the lowest rated one, and it was quite low, and Solitude was the highest rated, if I recall correctly, and it was quite high. So I don't think that's actually what's happening. I think these were just very hard to evaluate for a lot of people, and I think a lot of people were like, oh, this red one doesn't seem that great, it just deals damage to creatures. It's one of these things where I remember that people complaining, oh, the red one can't deal damage to your opponent's face, it can only deal damage to creatures.
What a shame. That really would have made the card so much more fun.
Well, it's like when you can read a line of rules text like that, and it reads like a nerf in some sense, because by just changing one word, you can make it more powerful. People, I think, inherently rate the card more lowly because they can so clearly see a more powerful iteration of it in their brain. Whereas, you wouldn't look at Solitude and say, well, why isn't it a 6/6, right? Because, that's a much bigger leap to, get to that level, even without that line of text. I mean, in any kind of environment where decks are playing on the creature combat axis, Fury is just, I think a non-starter. I would put it in the Oko level of broken and game ruining if you're playing a cube where every deck is winning through creature combat.
Yeah, it's funny. We saw it so much with Enlist. It seemed like everybody responding to the survey was just like, this would be great if I could tap a creature that didn't have summoning sickness. And it's like...
That's exactly the same
such
thing. That's such
a compelling thing that if there is a thing that looks like a nerf, it seems like a problem to be fixed, which, that makes sense why it resonates a certain way.
I think there's a memory issue with Enlist, though. It's the same reason that when you animate a land, it gives haste to the land in modern Magic. I think it's a little different, but to the main point, I want to say that I think the reason we're seeing these shifts that are not symmetrical across the cycle of Evoke Elementals has a lot to do with constructed results. A major theme of these retrospective analyses is that cube curators have a very tight feedback loop with constructed, or at least the curators who are consistently responding to our set surveys and things, because those are the most engaged subset of the already engaged subset that is the cube community. I remember listening to Dominaria's Judgment, and they were super high on Grief. And then, as it turns out, Black has been in a little bit of a nadir in terms of its metagame share in Modern. And so Grief has not seen play, or it's seen limited play, but it's part of a fringe reanimator or Stoneforge Mystic kind of flickery fringe deck is what I'm saying. Whereas Fury defined the format in some major ways, along with other cards that I'm sure we'll talk about today. And so I think that's why Fury, Solitude have seen increased play, and then Subtlety and Grief, not as much.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's not just a matter of this card is powerful in constructed in a vacuum, but if this card is powerful in the specific constructed metagame, that's going to translate to people evaluating it in Cube in a certain way. That's really interesting.
And it's funny, I'm just a casual observer of any constructed Magic, but my impression from what I've heard is that Fury was very relevant for a little while because it was very potent and a good answer to all these creature decks and a good answer to Ragavan, which was obviously a huge thing after Modern Horizons 2. And then the metagame kind of shifted because it was so devastating to play a deck that got ruined by Fury, because if your opponent had one, it was just there was no coming back from it, that a lot of those decks just kind of shifted out of the metagame, which meant that Fury was no longer quite as relevant. It still sees some play, but I think as of recording, it's seeing less play than Solitude, just because the kinds of decks that got ruined by Fury just were untenable, and so they became less relevant, therefore Fury became less relevant, and now it's not quite as effective in Modern as some of the other ones are.
Yeah.
That's the metagame.
Wild stuff. So that's my most overrated cards. Frankly, kind of embarrassing that there were essentially 4 cards. I rated a 3, the most confident I could possibly be that I was going to stick with that card for a long time to come, that all got cut, and all got cut for reasons that I now feel very strongly about. And then Turok sneaking in there at 2.8. And, I got a long list of honorable mentions here. Cards I rated at 2.5 or higher. There's 7 more cards I rated 2.5 or higher that have since been cut. I won't go through all those, but you can download the data if you want to see all my other answers if you want. Or honestly, listener, I would encourage you to do this for yourself, because I think it's very easy to have a kind of rose-colored memory of what your early set ratings were. And if you actually go and look at these numbers, you're going to be like, why on earth did I put that number there? That was the feeling I had looking through a lot of these. So it's very instructive, I think, to go look through your old responses.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the card that is my number 5 most overrated is another good illustration of this. So my number 5 was, I can't believe this, but for Commander Legends, my only test was Mana Confluence, which is a reprint, and apparently past me was like, oh, I'm going to pick this up while it's cheap, and I'm going to love it, and I'm going to play it, and I never did, and never played it, and I don't even feel the need for it now. So it's like, that's another reason, I guess, that there might be attrition in these like retrospective results. Simply like, if card availability is an issue, then people won't play cards that they wanted to.
It's really funny you say that, because I've actually had City of Brass on the cut list for my cube for a long time, just because ever since I broke Singleton for fixing, which is at this point now almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, it just feels kind of silly now. It's like, well, I would always take another fetch land or an on-color duel over a City of Brass. So this is like a, what used to be a very high pick in my cube, because it was one of the only flexible goes in any multicolored deck kind of cards you could play. Now it just feels like it's like, I guess I didn't get anything else. I guess I'll play the City of Brass. So that's a card I'm planning on cutting. And it's interesting to hear that you thought that Mana Confluence might be right for you, and now you're like, actually, I don't even bother to pick it up. One never came my way, and I don't feel like I missed out on anything.
Yeah. I am still on City of Brass, but that is because John Cultic Cube was the person who previewed the beautiful Double Masters.
That one is pretty.
Borderless version. And so every time I play it, I think of that, and it makes me happy.
Shout out to John.
Yeah.
We'll
John
see if he's
great.
listening to this. John, if you're listening to us, tweet at us. And if you're not, we'll know.
That's kind of mean. Before we drag John any further,
the trap is set.
Yeah, I want to talk about my 4th most overrated, and that was Strixhaven's Symmetry Sage, which I rated a 2.8 at the time of release. I was thinking, just play a Thoughtseize on turn 2, and then you've got yourself a free Delver of Secrets. And shortly after Strixhaven released, it occurred to me, wait, why wouldn't I just play another Delver of Secrets? There are 2 fantastic arts. There's the Nils Hamm original art and, some other fantastic ones. And so I just playing 2 Delver of Secrets now instead of Delver and Delver at home.
Yeah, you don't need Delver of Secrets at home when you can just play multiple. So that was, you hadn't broken Singleton for threats like that until Strixhaven or after Strixhaven?
Yeah, it was Strixhaven and Faithless Looting that gave me the idea, or gave me the desire to really break Singleton, because
the justification to do it.
Yeah, it was just the occasion. And it was actually Carly Majeur's Faithless Looting art that really tipped me over the edge because I could not say no to that.
Yeah, you're a big booster of that one.
Mm-hmm. And I don't have a Twitter, so there can't be a mob come after me for my unpopular opinion, but I don't care. Okay, my third most overrated card from this time period is Dothy Voidwalker from Modern Horizons 2, which I rated a 2.7. So the card is clearly strong on rate, but because I didn't realize this at the time, obviously, but because it replaces any card going to graveyard with an exile effect, it has this like polarizing kind of sideboard hosing gameplay that I really disliked. After just one or two drafts of my cube, I realized, man, I hate this play pattern. It is like hosing my opponent's Kroxa. It's hosing their Klothys activations or like their Delve mana. And I realized that the kind of tools that I like in my environment as far as graveyard hate is a card like Scrabbling Claws, which is like maybe the worst Relic of Progenitus that's ever been printed in terms of...
Hey now, let's not... I want to have you talk about Scrabbling Claws that way. Have you met Phyrexian Furnace if you want
you're
a worse
right.
Relic of
Furnace
Progenitus?
is worse. Furnace is worse. But like, nobody plays Scrabbling Claws in Constructed because there are quote-unquote better options because you don't care about your opponent's feelings as you are hosing their graveyard in Modern.
Right,
But
you just get Soul Guide Lantern or whatever because it is just better.
Right. But in my cube, I'm not running Dredge. I'm not running like degenerate Reanimator combos or Dredge combos that require hose pieces. So instead, I realized that Scrabbling Claws is perfect because it gives the opponent a chance to interact with a Kroxa or an Uro and like not lose the game immediately, but it also doesn't shut off the opponent's Delirium and Delve and these like fun deck building puzzles that I really love and want to encourage. So Dothy Voidwalker was the realization for me. It was when it kind of like crystallized for me that I can design graveyard hate that lets the opponent still feel good and still have a game plan.
Love that. Love that realization. I think it's a great point for most cube designers. And Dothy Voidwalker, I mean, put that in the category of stupid cards too. I mean, double black, it's got shadow, it's got this one-sided hosing effect, which affects everything that would go to your opponent's graveyard, whether it was put there from the battlefield or from their hand or whatever. Definitely a card that I think checks all those boxes of like not great play patterns if you're aiming for anything resembling a sort of fair interactive environment.
Yeah, it was just not fun, in my opinion.
Great in the Degenerate Microcube, I gotta say. Right at home there.
Yeah, I totally believe that. My number 2 most overrated card is pretty embarrassing, but it is from Kaldheim. It is Bind the Monster, and I gave this a 3.
Blue Swords to Plowshares, Parker.
I was thinking that it was the Blue Swords to Plowshares. I was wrong. Let's just put it like that. I was very wrong. The mythology reference is really interesting because it's referencing the moment when Odin ties the wolf Fenrir to the World Tree, and so it's a Norse mythology quote essentially, which is really cool. But the gameplay sucks. The card is kind of like giving your opponent a lava axe some amount of the time, and other times it's like, I don't know, I'd be happier to see a basic land over Bind the Monster sometimes, and that's not a good place to be. I don't exclusively pick cards for power level, but that was just unacceptable.
This is also the kind of thing I wonder, Parker, do you feel like if they actually printed a Blue Swords to Plowshares tomorrow, a card that actually was power level wise equivalent instead of Bind the Monster, which kind of maybe seemed like it might be, but in actuality was a little bit worse, would you be interested in that? Or are you kind of at the point now where you're like, maybe Blue doesn't need Swords to Plowshares, maybe Blue should have a weakness there or should have different kinds of effects under its color pie?
I would really have to think about it. I think I would test a Blue Swords to Plowshares, but I would be very intentional about noting any blowouts that occurred. So like your opponent is holding up blue. Usually that represents counterspell, mana leak, force spike, and so the opponent can kind of play around that. And if sometimes
but then they animate their creature land and use Swords to Plowshares it, and that can go pretty bad.
Right. Now, on the other hand, you could say the same thing about White and Mana Tithe, and I love Mana Tithe. So
maybe
I would really have to
Blue
see.
Swords to Plowshares then, yeah. I'm surprised that's not your number 1, Parker. I thought for sure that was going to be your number 1. So what is your actual number 1?
It is like a gross misevaluation of power level, but I think for my number 1 slot, it's like a 20 cards for the price of 1 misevaluation. So that's why it's taking the number 1 spot. This is the double-faced land cycles from Zendikar Rising. Perhaps the poster child of these is Agadim's Awakening, like you mentioned, Andy. But at the time of Zendikar Rising, I tested like 30-something cards from this set. Many of them were the double-faced lands. And I was very high on them on power level. I still think they are fairly strong on power level, but, well, like there's this weird evolution that happened. I tested all of these cards. I learned that lands are, in fact, very strong. One of, maybe I'll just say Magic's strongest card type because you can't do anything without a land.
Manaless Dredge would like to know your location.
Yeah, okay.
They do need Bazaar, though. That's technically a land, so you still win.
I will reveal my, what's that counter spell angel thing?
Chancellor of the Annex.
I will reveal my Chancellor of the Annex and counter your Manaless Dredge. Yeah, so like what happened is I tested all these lands, loved the gameplay, and then I realized that I could achieve similar kinds of gameplay by playing Celestial Colonnade and several Tundras instead of just one, and several sets of fetch lands, and the Triumph cycle, which had just come out. And that kind of gameplay led to me playing Watchwolves, which we've discussed before. And the Watchwolves pushed out these original MDFCs just because it sped up the format by a lot. So it's a weird evolution where I like started loving these cards, and then that evolved my cube to a point where they were no longer strong, and also exposed kind of the weaknesses of the tap lands in particular, such that I'm no longer on any of them except I think I'm still playing Shatterskull Smashing. And I've also got to admit, while I'm at it, I initially dismissed the kind of externalities of having a bunch of double-faced cards in a cube, but it turned out to be kind of a hassle to manage all of these game pieces. And my opponents would often not bother. They would just play the proxy card that said both sides of rules text. And that was a bummer for me because I like looking at card art, and they weren't using the card art. So
a subset of cube designers were definitely very, very high on these modal double-face cards. And you say that, the power level was actually there for you. I think a lot of people found the power level was not there for them, or the power level was the kind of power that they didn't necessarily want. I mean, what those kinds of cards, I think, allow for is very consistent gameplay, right? If you have a bunch of modal double-face lands in your deck, you can play 18, 19, 20 lands if, 5 of them are also spells, and then you're dramatically decreasing the chances you're going to lose to Mana Screw, you're dramatically decreasing the chances you're going to lose to Mana Flood, and what you're paying is like a little bit of efficiency on the other side, right? Like the backside of these cards is not quite as efficient as a card you'd want to play if it didn't have the land on the back, because you're paying something for that modality. And I wonder if a lot of people basically found that it led to this kind of like neutered gameplay where it's like, we're making decisions, but the decisions are all kind of, minimized because these game pieces are individually less impactful. And, it kind of goes back to like our, Tarmogoyf Elvish Visionary conversation where it's like, your deck's really consistent with a bunch of Elvish Visionaries, but what actual gameplay does that lead to? Is it lead to people jamming, slightly overcosted game pieces into each other in these long drawn out games because everyone has these flexible modal cards and it therefore is lacking in the sort of bombs to carry along with it?
Yeah, you might be right there. I mean, Watchwolf certainly presents more like cardboard per mana cost than a card.
Yeah, Watchwolf is a good Tarmogoyf.
It is.
Tangled Florahedron, definitely an Elvish Visionary.
Yeah, especially compared to, Tangled Florahedron. And one like benefit of having such rate juiced into these like gold cheap power outliers is that your cardboard stretches a lot further. You don't need to play 6 lands, so the need for these modal double-faced cards is somewhat decreased. So that's maybe another structural factor that led to these cards really becoming redundant or superfluous in my environment.
It's got to be said that even outside of the cube world, there were definitely people in the like constructed Magic content creation world that were saying that these double-faced lands were a huge mistake and Constructed was going to be overrun with them. Why would you ever play regular lands in your deck ever again? And that proved to not be true. I mean, these lands are totally fine and Constructed. There is a new, well, not a new, but like the Charbelcher deck in Modern is very heavily based on these cards now because you want to play no lands in your deck, in your Charbelcher deck, and you can afford to do that when you play all these double-faced cards that are only lands on the back. But aside from that, I mean, this didn't really have an impact on any Constructed format that was outsized, and I think it's an example of R&D getting it right and a bunch of players' early evaluations being off. These are actually fine. They're much closer to a, I mean, like, none of them got banned. None of them were, like, overly dominant. It ultimately seemed like these were each just closer to, like, a cycling land or whatever than they were some sort of, like, new broken thing. I always think back to the fact that when Zendikar Rising was spoiled, I added a bunch of the Moto Double Face cards. I was not very high on the ones that enter the battlefield tapped. I don't think I added almost any of those at the beginning, maybe a couple. And I'm still not very high on those. But I did remember I added Lonely Sandbar because I remember thinking when I saw, I think it was Selundi's Vision or like some card draw spell that was also stapled to a land on the back, I was like, man, I kind of wish they would just give us a blue cantrip and said blue draw a card or was a tabbed land on the back. And then I was like, wait, that's just Lonely Sandbar. And so I put Lonely Sandbar in my cube because, I think oftentimes recontextualizing the same mechanic can make you think about it differently. And here I was wishing they would print some Modal Double Face card that was mechanically identical to a card that existed that I had overlooked for my entire cube's existence that I've added and I'm still on. I'm still on Lonely Sandbar, and I still think it's pretty fun.
And it doesn't even have a weird back face.
No
it's
weird
all
back
just written
face.
on the front of the card.
You can buy it back with Red and 6. It's just better than the Modal Double Face card would be.
Yeah, that's another advantage of the Neon Kamigawa channel lands is that they're only single-faced. Although you do have to read like a lot of words for Boseiju, for example.
And Boseiju can't get thought seeds. Maybe that's a downside for Boseiju, though. Maybe it's a little too non-interactive. Depends on who you ask.
It's interesting just sort of hearing and thinking about our different design philosophies for these different environments. I want to talk about cards just for my regular cube, which is a sort of medium low powered cube. It's a lot based on, creature combat and little sort of card interactions. And actually 3 of these cards are still in the cube. I just doing the exercise was trying to think of what are the things that my sort of opinion of has changed the most. And it's not like I've put in a bunch of cards that were very splashy and exciting that ended up playing vastly differently. I just have been very cautious about the cards that I've chosen and chosen them for, I guess, with specific expectations. So the first I have is Emergent Sequence. So this is a sorcery that fetches up a land and puts 1 or 2 counters on it. And this was a card that I was really excited about when it came out, just because it interacts with a lot of stuff in the environment. It interacts with lands, it interacts with +1/+1 counters, spells matter potentially. It can do a lot of little things. But it's interesting the environment has changed a little bit, and I think that floor of it being, well, the floor isn't actually a 2-mana 2/2. The floor is a 2-mana 1/1, is actually just something that a lot of the green decks are not as interested in as I expected, and a lot of those little interactions that I was hoping to get out of it, I just don't see come up that often.
Yeah, that card is like, you can read it 2 different ways. You can read it as like, here is a really interesting way to put this bread and butter effect in the cube, where it's like some ramp, but now this is some ramp that actually, interacts with the +1/+1 counter decks, interacts with the lands matter decks. Or you could look at it and say, here's an overly complicated rampant growth, or an overly complicated, I can't think of like the vanilla 2-mana mana dork. There's like the 1/3, doesn't matter. Or if it's just a vanilla 2-mana mana dork, right? And if it just plays like that, but it's got all this additional complexity, and you got to shuffle your stupid deck, and you got to get like dice out, then it starts to feel kind of bad.
Yeah, so this is still in the cube, but it's definitely just interesting looking at this and thinking that was a card that I was really high on. I thought it was just a perfect fit. And if we do a couple more drafts and I keep seeing it just sort of not do the thing and not sort of make up for that complexity, make that complexity pay for its rent, then it's definitely something I might be considering cutting. Next up, another thing that, just fits in very similar space is Fearless Fledgling. This just stood out to me because I gave it a 3, the highest rating you could possibly give it. And looking at it again, I still do like this card, but I don't know if I like it.
I thought you were still high on this card, yeah.
Well, it's good to do this review just to sort of ask myself, how do I really feel about these cards? And one of the things that I don't love about this is just the way that it's been pretty polarizing in terms of how other people feel about it. The fact that it only has flying generally on your turn can be a little bit frustrating, and the fact that you're sort of depending on land drops late in the game to actually make this relevant can actually be pretty polarizing. I had a game a couple weeks ago where literally the game came down to, do I draw a land here to be able to jump this bird or not? Which, you could label a lot of effects that way. You need to draw a removal spell to stay in the game, or you need to draw a burn spell, whatever. But it does feel a little bit weird here, when it's like, oh, I want to draw this land, but if it had been a 2-turn clock rather than a 1-turn clock, I still would have sort of lost. So it does lead to sort of some funny gameplay situations that aren't necessarily always fun.
That is interesting. It does make the kind of coin flip variance a little more visible, possibly in certain circumstances,
right?
Where you might think in other circumstances, like, yeah, sure, if I had drawn my threats in a different order, or if I had drawn a different density of interactive spells or something, then this game would have gone differently. That doesn't feel as much like a coin flip as I need to draw one of the 9 remaining lands in my deck and I win, or I don't and I lose, and there's no, like, in between. That card ended up being more powerful in your cube than I anticipated it would. I've been beat down by a Fearless Fledgling a couple times. That card can be very scary.
Yeah, that's, I guess, another good point about sort of the variance and how does that variance feel meaningful and feel productive and feel like something you're building towards. Is this card is really, really powerful on turn 2. It's much less powerful if you draw it late in the game, and I think that might be another thing that sort of makes me a little bit less interested in it. Next up, I've got Chrome Courier from Modern Horizons. This is another one that I thought, this is a slam dunk. I do have a little bit of an artifact theme that bleeds over into white, and this just seemed like a perfect card to be able to push that a little bit more. And it's really interesting how, on one hand, I do like the way that it's played, in that I think it's actually encouraged people to make that white splash in a sort of artifact-themed deck more often. I've actually seen that come up a couple times. And we've talked about signpost cards and how I think that you're overall the opinion that they don't really make sense with the sort of level of enfranchisement that we and most of the people that we play with are playing at. But
yeah,
I've
basically my
seen...
argument, and for those that haven't heard my argument, it's basically that I think experienced players are just going to ignore your signposts. They're not going to say, oh, a blue-white artifact matters card, I must draft the blue-white artifact deck. They're just going to take the good cards, and the signposts are not going to have their intended effect.
Totally, but I think that this card I've actually seen have that effect, and I think it might be less about somebody consciously saying, oh, this is the signpost card, I'm going to build around it, as much as it sort of bridges from, I already have Sai, I have a couple artifacts I want to play, and this card also makes sense there, so maybe they're just more open to thinking about putting them in the mind space that a white splash might make sense. So on one hand, I do...
I was about to say, we're in the overrated cards, right? Well, you're saying all these things about
I'm
that
saying
are good
all these
about
good
it.
things, but here's the problem is I don't think this card is actually very powerful in the environment.
it's
I think
pretty
it's
weak.
actually a little bit of a trap. Just a 3-mana 1/1 flyer isn't that effective. So more than overrated, I just feel conflicted about this card, where I feel like it is having a positive effect on the environment in certain ways, but then just isn't actually that fun to play with because you draw it and you just feel like, well, this body is so irrelevant. This card's actually going to put me behind a little bit.
It's really not a very good card, I think it has to be said. Like, compare it to Cloud Conceer, which has 1 more power and never whiffs.
Right, that makes a huge
sure,
difference.
sometimes Chrome Query gives you some selection. You get to find the good artifact you want at the top of your deck. I think Cloud Conceer is a much, much better card, and it's only 1 color instead of being in 2 colors, but it doesn't do that work of getting players to think about drafting their deck differently, to put more artifacts in there to make this sort of theme come together.
Yeah, it's funny, and Cloud Conceer was in this cube for a little while, and I cut it because it was a little bit too good
Card's
and a little
kinda
bit just too easy to include in every deck, and just kind of like slowed down games that I was traded with things and put players up in cards. So yeah, that's a really interesting contrast there. So one other kind of dorky card, and then one other more interesting card. Beaming Defiance is just a combat trick from Strixhaven, and I don't really know why I chose it. I don't know why I was so high on it. I gave it a very high rating. I gave this a rating of 2. So, not spectacular, but if I'm looking at this card now, I would say this is below
Probably wouldn't
average.
even test it if it was in a recent set.
So I think that, I have a little bit of a heroic theme, but there have just been so many other cards that have been printed recently, between, things like the Adventurers and other creatures that can target things, different ways to make that heroic theme feel relevant without playing this card that's just not going to be exciting for anybody outside that context. So that was an easy cut. And I'm not really sure why I gave it such a high rating, because I think I even said in my survey that I don't expect this to last very long.
Maybe a misclick.
That's entirely possible.
I actually placed an order with an online site and purchased a Beaming Defiance because it has reminder text for hexproof on it, and I'm developing a battle box that's intended to function even if it's somebody's first time playing Magic. So it's actually perfect for that list because it gives the power toughness boost and also spells out what hexproof means.
Teaches them what a mechanic does. What an interesting perspective, Parker. I love that.
Yeah, but I would not have known about this card if I had not just...
You would not have seen this card and been like, wow, what a slam dunk in the regular cube.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, but that's the thing about this environment is it's not an environment full of slam dunks. It's an environment where like I'm intentionally trying to make everything feel like a C+.
I definitely see cards in spoiler season and think this is a regular cube
It's a
card,
regular
though.
card. It's just like a C+.
So regular. It's incredibly regular.
I mean, you do definitely have, there is a vibe. There's definitely a design ethos that is embodied in the cube, and it's not hard to see a new card and think, well, this kind of matches that design ethos that I've seen in other cards that could totally fit here.
It's a great vibe. Yeah.
So this last card I have here definitely does not fit that vibe, which is Master of Death. This is a card that I was really excited for and kind of knew it was going to be a little bit problematic, but it just does so many things. Like, I think it does fit that aesthetic.
Kind of does the one thing.
It does fit that aesthetic
Over
in terms
and over
of
again.
Over and over.
It deals with graveyards, it rewards you for looting, it has Surveil, which is just an awesome mechanic that I love. But the problem is, even though the themes were there and that sort of aesthetic sense was there, the actual play pattern, especially in this environment where games can go a little bit longer, was just do this every single turn. It really gummed up the board and was just really overpowered. So themes were on point, but the actual play patterns were just not at all what I was looking for. So
Now, I loved it because I only ever played it and never had it played against me, so I don't understand why it was cut. It was so much fun for me. It was made the game so much better.
So we should talk about overrated and underrated players, not so much the cards, maybe.
It's actually a very funny kind of transition because Master of Death is actually on my honorable mentions list for most underrated cards. I did not include it in my testing list at all. It was not on my radar. I did not think it was good enough. I think I may have talked about it in the set review as being like, this card's really cool. I don't think it's powerful enough, but I might play it otherwise. And I found that it actually is totally viable and actually kind of plays like the way you described you imagine it might play in the regular cube. It kind of plays like that in the Bun Magic cube. I found that, discarding that to Liliana of the Veil or, using it to surveil over cards into your graveyard for Kroxa or whatever is fun and potent, but it's like in my environment, it's not correct to just use your mana every turn playing a Master of Death because there's more powerful things you can be doing. In the regular cube, that's the best thing you can do for 3 mana almost any turn of the game. And so it becomes very repetitive because that's the correct thing to do. Whereas it's much more like a utility creature in the Bun Magic cube where I think it actually turned out to be great. So it's funny, I think you and I both misrated that card. Maybe you thought this actually won't be too bad, and then it actually was kind of disgusting in your environment. And I overlooked it. I was like, that card doesn't do anything. And then it actually is totally playable, and I really love it in the Bun Magic cube.
I'm glad it found a home somewhere.
Have you tried Lazav the Multifarious? That might be about the right power level for you.
The card is so cool.
It's very cool.
You can play it in Legacy with Phyrexian Dreadnought.
I haven't thought about that, but that's pretty interesting. I like just having... There isn't really anything in blue-black in the environment currently that rewards graveyard interactions in that way. I mean, there is... in black, there is Isarath the Awakener, which is a similar sort of get things in the graveyard and you can reanimate them. But I like, similar to Chrome Courier, that potentially being a way into encouraging a different color pair.
Yeah, it's also super modular. Its power level depends on the cards surrounding it, and that's pretty sweet, I think.
I'm going to put that on a list.
Yeah, it's one of these cards that it's going to play different in every game. Depending on what deck you drafted, it's going to encourage you to draft different kinds of cards to make it better or worse. The exact kind of variability in play that I find so fun.
It'll even play differently turn to turn. There will be some turns where your bomb gets killed and you want to turn it back into a bomb, or there will be other turns where you don't have the mana, and so you turn it into a flyer for a turn.
All right, moving on to underrated cards. Boys, I gotta say, I think this is even more embarrassing than the overrated cards for me. I don't know if you feel the same way. So I did a first pass looking at my ratings from the surveys and said, oh, here are cards that I rated a 1 or a 1.5 that I actually ended up really liking. And I was like, this list's not that long. I guess I didn't underrate too many cards. And then I had the realization, wait a minute. I bet there are cards I didn't include in my testing list at all that I ended up playing, and that list was way longer than I thought it was going to be, and frankly, kind of embarrassing. I have my top 5 here, which I kind of ranked these subjectively. They don't necessarily correspond to the ones that had the lowest ratings that I ended up continuing to play. Quick mention of some honorable mention cards that didn't make this list. Master of Death is on that list. It's a card I was totally off my radar, and now I really quite like. Cave of the Frost Dragon was, for some reason, one of the creature lands from Adventures of the Forgotten Realms that I didn't even think I was going to play, and is probably my favorite now. It's up there at the end of the Bugbear. It's pretty close. Seagate Stormcaller, another card that I didn't test because I was like, this is just Snapcaster Mage at home. When in actuality, I think it's a pretty different card. You really want to be in a proactive deck if you're playing Seagate Stormcaller. It doesn't work with counterspells, but it's fantastic to double up on a Thoughtseize or a Lightning Bolt or whatever. And that card has been really fun for me too. One last honorable mention, just so I can give Parker a chance to flex. I was relatively low on Clarion Spirit and Blood Sky Berserker, giving them both a 1.5, and love those two cards now. And Parker, you called it out in your hot take.
Yes, I'm even flexing right now in triumph. I feel so vindicated.
All right, those are the honorable mentions. Let's get on to the actual top 5 most underrated cards. Number 5 is Urza Saga for me. I rated this a 1.3 in the Bud Magic Cube, which is pretty low considering now I do really like the card and I think it's going to stick around for a while. The more embarrassing thing, didn't even have it on the list for the Degenerate Micro Cube, and I would consider that a rock solid 3 in that cube. It is so fantastic in the Shops deck to say, I'm just going to run nothing but fast mana, various spheres and thorns and whatever to stop everyone from casting spells, and my win condition will be this land that I don't have to cast any spells to kill you with, right? I just play this land and I make a bunch of giant construct tokens and beat you down. That card is a defining card of the Degenerate Micro Cube now, and it didn't even occur to me at the time. This is one of the only examples on this whole list, I think, where I was just kind of at a loss. I didn't know what to think of this card at release. I was like, is this good? Is it bad? I really don't know. Is it too good because it's a land that can spit out 2 reasonably sized creatures and tutor something up? Is it not good enough because it's a colorless land and it only sticks around for a couple turns? Really was kind of up the river without a paddle with this card. Now I do really like it. I think it is powerful, but powerful in a way that does demand some building around. You definitely can just put this in an aggressive deck. I'll play this in a mono-weight aggressive deck with no artifacts to fetch with it, because if your mana base is rock solid and you can afford a couple utility lands, then this is one of the best ones you can have just by making 2/2/2s. I mean, that's a fantastic fail case for a land in the late game. And then as soon as you have a Bone Splitter or whatever to get with it, it goes from very good to great. Or you can play it in multicolored decks where you intentionally have a little package of cards you can go and get with it. But I think if you're playing it in a multicolored deck, you do need a good reason to do so. You got to be fetching something up with it or have other artifacts to synergize with it. It's just one of these cards that really does change a lot depending on how you draft and build around it, which I like. So I think it's a really cool card that ended up actually getting there for me. I will say I don't think it would have gotten there if this card hadn't seen so much Constructed play, which is not because I necessarily inherited Constructed's evaluation of it, but more because players know how it works because they're playing it in Constructed. They play it in EDH, they see it in Modern, they see it in Legacy. Otherwise, I think the complexity of this card would not be something I'd be willing to stomach if people are like, wait, I've never seen this card. What does it do? It's a land and an enchantment and a saga? What's even going on here? But the fact that it ended up being so visible in Magic at large, I think makes it a reasonable inclusion.
It's kind of like the Splinter Twin thing. If you just see Splinter Twin and it's your first day playing Magic, you won't necessarily know that it needs to, or it can be paired with Pestermite for, an infinite combo.
If you do know that on your first day playing Magic, then you're a very special and powerful person.
You were taught by the wrong person, is what I would say.
That's the truth. But Urza Saga, to pair it with Mishra's Bauble or Shadow Spear or whatever. Stoneforge Mystic, to look for Batterskull or Umezawa's Jite. It's a really good nuance that you bring up, Andy, that it's not just constructed power level that affects our cube evaluations of a card. It's also familiarity, and a card that sees constructed play is less complex for the average Magic player who encounters it.
Yeah. Honestly, this is something I think we maybe don't talk about enough in cube design. When I'm introducing someone to the Degenerate Micro Cube that knows Magic but maybe has never played the cube before, and I'm trying to give them a 2-minute, you're about to do this thing, it's very unfamiliar to regular Magic, I basically say here's the cube, here's the restrictions, you're playing a smaller deck, here's what that means roughly, and then I explain shops, because most Magic players do not know what a shops deck looks like because you have to play Vintage or be familiar with Vintage to recognize that. And I explain the card Flash because that card is banned everywhere, so no one knows what Flash does. They look at it and don't even think it's any good, and it's actually by far the best combo card, I would argue, in that cube. The other stuff, Reanimator, Sneak Attack, Show and Tell, Oath of Druids even, those things are much more recognizable. People have seen those in other vintage cubes. They have seen Reanimator decks across all different formats across time, and so I don't have to explain those things. I do have to explain that you can flash in a Worldspine Worm and at instant speed have 15 power of Tramplers across 3 bodies, and that is the best way to win a game in this environment. So that familiarity, I think, is really important in terms of when we actually think about complexity in our cube environments.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've, while we're on the topic, some of my least satisfying cube experiences have been ones where I felt like I didn't have the metagame knowledge necessary to build a successful deck. Yeah, I've learned that I need to stay away from combo or like old school combos, I guess, in my first time in a cube format, because I'm just really bad at evaluating cards in those contexts. And if I didn't know that about myself, I would enjoy playing other people's cubes a lot less.
My number 4, I cheated a little bit again. I combined 2 cards here because they are pretty similar to me in terms of, I rated them both a 1. They were on my list, but I rated them a 1. They're now 2 of my favorite cards in my cube, I would say, like probably within the top 30 cards, my favorite cards in my entire cube. And they also both got low ratings for me because they are essentially just stats. And the cards are Murktide Regent and Luminarch Aspirant. These are 2 cards that I was like, why do I want a big dragon? Or why do I just want, a card that just gets bigger over the course of the game? Like, seems kind of boring, seems like a terrible top deck, etc. Both these cards ended up having play patterns that were so much more interesting and exciting to me than I expected. Being able to play a big dragon is a lot of fun. Killing your opponent with a big flyer is a lot of fun. Playing a deck that can intentionally churn through a bunch of cards to get to an early big dragon is a nice payoff that is like the right amount of risk reward. A big dragon's hard to remove by some decks unless you're playing black or some selective white cards. Like your burn deck's going to struggle to get rid of a big dragon. So Murktide Regent ended up being just fantastic. It also turns out that I really like Delve as a mechanic, and this is like the one proactive Delve card in blue. It's the one that actually kills your opponent. It's great to dig through time in Treasure Cruise, but that just kind of stretches the game out, and they probably lost to the Treasure Cruise, but maybe not for 4 or 5 turns. They lose to that dragon pretty quickly, so that ended up being just a really fun card that I love. I honestly might not have even put this in my cube, except for the fact that it was in my pre-release pool. When I did my pre-release, I put it right in, and it was immediately way more impressed with it, both in terms of power level and play patterns than I expected to be, and it will be in my cube for a long time to come. Luminarch Aspirant, I kind of thought at spoiler season, and this is one I was like way off from the cube community at large. I think people for the most part were not that high on Murktide Regent, and their opinions have changed seeing how powerful it is and constructed and whatnot. Aspirant was the number 1 most tested card from Zendikar Rising, which was a very popular set. I looked at it and I was like, just stats, seems boring. I like my, aggressive 2-drops to be good in the late game, good in the early game, and ideally offer some kind of interactivity or flexibility, and it didn't feel like it did that. It turns out that for me, deciding what creature to put that +1/+1 counter on is a subtle but really interesting and fun decision to make. It's really interesting to figure out how much you should diversify your power across multiple threats, how much you should put it onto one threat and risk getting blown up by removal, but give yourself better attacks because now they have no blocks against this thing. Those like little dynamics of just creature combat and where you put that counter are really fascinating and fun with Luminarch Aspirant, and it's not even that bad of a top deck because you do get that first +1/+1 counter with effective haste if you have something in play already, so it does affect the board immediately as a 2-drop, which doesn't have a huge impact, but it's something, right? It's better than most other 2-drops that are otherwise quote-unquote bad top decks. So my lesson for me here was that sometimes vanilla stats are fun and great, and every card doesn't have to be complicated and have novel rules text in isolation to still be fun.
Definitely agree with that. And yeah, big dragons are cool. Murktide Regent might be a little heavy on the early aspect of big dragon, but I definitely like a big dragon.
You gotta work for it, though. You gotta work for it. My top 3 cards are all cards I did not even include in my testing list, and are all cards that I'm now quite high on. Number 3 is Skyclave Apparition. I looked this over because I am historically very low on Oblivion Rings and especially Banisher Priests as removal. I don't love having that extra layer of complexity and interactivity in the removal. I've said before that Banisher Priest I don't love because it's a creature which you theoretically would want in a deck that's trying to pressure your opponent, but then so often being a creature is just a liability, and that tension of just feeling like you have this fragile temporary answer that at some point is just going to get lightning bolted and then they're going to get their thing back just kind of feels awful. And I think I said on a past episode in the past month or so that Apparition ended up being very different from a play pattern perspective, even though mechanically it bears so much resemblance to a Banisher Priest. And the reason it's so different is that the transformation of any given non-land permanent into a vanilla creature of power and toughness equal to its mana value is a substantial downgrade to basically any card in my entire environment, right? If you're getting rid of a Planeswalker and turning it into a vanilla thing, like, it's a big downgrade, such that getting your Skyclave Apparition removed or trading with it in combat or something is not the blowout that it would be if it was a Banisher Priest, which to me just takes the like very polarizing play patterns of a Banisher Priest, which on the ceiling, a Banisher Priest is much better. It says, this thing's gone forever, and I get to attack you a whole bunch, deal a bunch of damage, and that's just stronger. The floor, though, is much worse, where you lose your Banisher Priest at an inopportune moment, and the thing comes back, and it's a whole blowout. And this just kind of takes that very polarizing curve for me and like evens it out a little bit. You still, it still matters whether your opponent has a removal spell. They're still likely to try and remove it if they can, but it's not always like this immediate slam dunk, this obvious play pattern of like, well, the game now is about whether or not I can remove that Banisher Priest, right? It's not quite that bad. It's more like this kind of textured in-between space. And so yeah, I really like that card, and just being able to have more answers for non-creature permanents that are main deckable and are not the like disenchant style of like sideboard effect has been a boon to my environment, I think. It gives you a way to actually get rid of their Umezawa's Jite or whatever in white without having to play otherwise kind of narrow sideboard cards.
I wonder if a big part of that is not just that it is more powerful than I think a lot of people first assumed, that difference in giving the player back whatever you Oblivion ranked, but instead just giving them back a token, but also just feels very different from a sort of gameplay experience perspective. It doesn't feel like you've regressed when you lose your creature.
That's
and
actually
it goes
a good
back
point.
to the player. Like the game's just moving forward in a different way, which I think is just actually more interesting.
Yeah, it could be just an emotional effect of like, I played this whole spell, and then 2 turns went by, and now I'm back where I started,
Right,
and that feels
exactly.
bad. Whereas here, you're never back where you started. You're always somewhere new and different. And, maybe it's still pretty bad for you, but at least it's a new kind of bad instead of the same kind of bad you were in before. So I think that card's great now, and I'm really quite high on it, and I just overlooked it completely because of my heuristic of I don't like Banisher Priests. Number 2, I overlooked because it just seemed pretty boring to me again. I guess it's kind of a theme here. That's Expressive Iteration. I looked at this card and I was like, this is better than Chart a Course, but it's not that much better than Chart a Course. It's not like deserves to be a gold card better than Chart a Course. It can't be that good. As I sit here today, I would say that Expressive Iteration and Chart a Course are not even on the same planet of card evaluation. It's not even close. Chart a Course is very narrow, maybe something I'd play in a cube where I had Reanimator or like other very strong reasons to be discarding cards. But aside from that, I mean, what Chart a Course can't do is very often like find you your third land drop and also draw you a card on the third turn of the game, which is exactly what Expressive Iteration does. It so often just says like, yeah, I find my next land drop no matter what, and also keep drawing my cards whenever I need to. And, I love card draw spells. I love cantrips and stuff. And because I love cantrips so much, I've definitely over the years cut down on my actual raw card advantage, like card draw spells, in favor of more just 1-for-1 card selection and cantrips. And I'm really grateful to have another card that I think people are excited to play. I think they're excited to get. I think it's a pull into blue-red. I think it's good enough that if you are playing one of those 2 colors and halfway through the first pack you see an Expressive Iteration, you're most likely going to be pulled into playing both those colors. And it's like it's in the same sort of pantheon to me now as your Treasure Cruises or Dig Through Times, your actual card-positive spells that are worth taking over Ponder or Preordain because they're that good.
Yeah, and you're not alone. Only 12% of people that responded to the Strixhaven survey were testing this card initially, but that's increased by almost 30%.
One of the cards that has seen the biggest increase in play from between the perspective and present-day stats of all the cards we're looking at.
And I'll actually even add a little more detail there. And thank you to listener Sulla 2012 who suggested this to me. It was a really good piece of advice that isn't in the article, but I want to share it here. The average Strixhaven card saw about 1 to 2% less play, so like a 1 to 2% attrition over time. Expressive Iteration is 9 standard deviations away from the mean there. So it's hard to overstate how much more play it's seeing relative to the average Strixhaven card. It is by
I
far
also
the
wonder
standout
how much
from
that
set.
average would come down if you just took Expressive Iteration out of that data set.
Exactly. It is a
I feel like it would go
huge
from
outlier.
1 to 2% decrease in play to like 5 or 6% across the board because this one card is pulling it up by so much.
Yeah, there are only 3 or 4 other cards that had a positive play rate, change in play rate at all.
And I mean, it would be silly to say that this is not strongly informed by Constructed. This card has ended up being so good in Modern and Legacy that people are calling for it to be banned. And that certainly has affected mine, and I'm sure the Cube designers' evaluations of it. I never would have thought at spoiler season this was good enough to pull you into playing blue-red early pack, and it absolutely is. The card is really messed up.
Do you enjoy casting it, though?
I actually do. I
Okay.
really, really do. Really what it plays as 95% of the time for me is you exile the land you're going to play for turn.
Mm-hmm.
And so that decision's made for you. Then you get to choose the other 2 cards which one you want. And so it's like, it's a 2 mana, like rampant growth plus sleight of hand, in one card essentially. It doesn't actually ramp you. You have to actually use your land drop for turn, but
It's like a rampant growth, only it counts as your land for turn. That's quite a...
Look, it's hard to explain. I do actually enjoy casting. I really do. I think it's fun, and drawing cards is always fun. I mean, most players in Magic enjoy drawing cards, and this is the kind of card draw that can hang in my environment on power level. So I do enjoy casting, and I absolutely do. My number one is a card we have talked about on the show before. My most underrated card from all of these sets that cycled out in 2022 is Asika's Chariot. This is a card that I knew was powerful. I was like, yeah, this card's good. I mean, I think it's easy to look at it and be like, this is a lot of stats for 4 mana. It's a potentially snowballing threat. Like, we know it's going to be powerful. I just thought, these are not play patterns I'm going to enjoy. Like, why do I want this, like, complicated, weird way to make tokens? Why do I want to be, like, cloning a token? That seems odd. It just didn't seem like the kind of play pattern I wanted on my, like, 4 mana mid-range threats in green decks. And as it turns out, it's, like, the perfect threat. I look at every other one of my 4-drops now, and I'm like, why aren't you as fun to play with as Asika's Chariot? Because that card is just so much more fun than the other ones to me. My favorite things, which I've said before in the show, are that it is somewhat answerable by almost any kind of interactive spell, right? You can use a removal spell to remove one of the tokens so that they maybe can't crew it and can't get any value off of it. You can use a removal spell to wait for them to crew it and then remove the actual chariot itself. You can use a shatter effect or a disenchant effect to get rid of the chariot before they even have a chance to crew it, and they're left with just the 2/2 tokens. You can play a board wipe, and now you get rid of both of the tokens, but they still have this chariot around. They still might play something later on to crew it and get some value off of it. There are all of these ways to interact with it such that it's not the kind of thing where they play it and it's just like, well, I can't do anything. It's lights out. But none of those ways fully answer it, which is important for a 4-mana card in my environment with such a low curve and so much removal and interaction. Playing a true 4-mana Baneslayer would be a liability in my environment, and so I'm kind of priced into playing more Muldriftery cards, but the cost of that so often is that the card is not splashy, it's not immediately impactful, it's kind of a slow value thing that draws the game out, and Chariot is not that. Chariot is very splashy, it is impactful, it has this really fun long tail of different tokens you can clone, which makes it really exciting. I have yet to live the dream of copying something with Fable of the Mirror Breaker and then cloning that token with the Asika's Chariot, but I can't wait to do it. That's on my short list of things I really want to do in my cube. It's just a card that I think has, for my tastes, like near perfect play patterns, and I didn't think so at first. I thought this card is not worth it compared to my other mid-range threats. It's also really notable here that many of my other honorable mention overrated cards were just kind of random 4 and 5 drop cards that I thought would see play, and I think we've learned, and Parker mentioned in the article, that there's just a lot of options if you're playing powerful mid-range cards. We get a big handful with every set of like powerful rares and mythics at like mid to high parts of the mana curve that are very impactful. There's no shortage of those if you want them, which means that there's a lot more competition for that space in your environment, which means that they have to clear such a higher bar. So it's notable to me that Asika's Chariot is in this class of cards. It's another, mid-range threat. There's probably, 30 cards from Magic's history that are also 4 mana that would probably have maybe the exact same time-traveling supercomputer impact on win percentage as Asika's Chariot, but none of them are even close in terms of how much fun they are to play with, to me, to Asika's Chariot.
I think that thing you mentioned about how much competition the Chariot has is a function of 4 and 5 mana cards and like even sometimes 3 mana kind of mid-rangey cards. Those are at a price where they're typically not going to do much in modern or even Pioneer sometimes, older formats. And so Wizards of the Coast can inject a lot of power into those mana values without fear of breaking older formats, but they do get to shape the standard play experience fairly significantly. So I think that's why we see so many of them. And you're right that generally they do decrease in play, but the Chariot is an exception to this.
So what I feel like I've learned from looking at my underrated cards is that I should look more closely at otherwise boring or simple cards, because oftentimes a on-the-face boring or simple card can actually lead to very interesting games, and the games are what matter, obviously, not the individual game pieces. And also, I should just be careful with heuristics that I have, sort of ingrained in me. The heuristic of Banisher Priests are cards that don't fit in my environment really kept me off of Skyclave Apparition, where I should have maybe seen that was actually quite different, and the superficial resemblance to cards I don't like shouldn't have steered me away from it.
Are you calling a Seeker's Chariot a simple and boring card?
That is the exception. I'm calling Murktide Regent, Luminarch Aspirant, and Expressive Iteration they're kind of basic cards. They're not like jump off the page exciting at you from a pure mechanics standpoint, but the actual games they lead to, I think, are. Urza Saga and a Seeker's Chariot are very complicated.
Yeah, great point.
those ones have a lot going on.
It's a really simple card. It's just an enchantment land.
All right, Parker, time to come clean. What are your underrated cards? I hope they're at least as embarrassing as mine.
There are some embarrassments here. My fifth place and kind of honorable mentions are the entire cycle of creature lands from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. I was not in love with how wordy the text box was on these cards, especially Den of the Bugbear initially, and I wasn't in love with the fact that they enter-tapped unless you control one or fewer, which is different than the fast lands, which I also run. So there was
it's annoying.
A little bit of confusion there, and all in all, I was not too excited about them. However, I have found that I love the way these play. I love the kind of rate of each of these is in a sweet spot where they will often be activated, but it is never exclusively correct to activate them. And that's what you mentioned about Master of Death in your environment, Andy. And the other thing I love about these is the really unique and kind of eye-popping showcase frames for these. It may be obvious to our listeners by now, but I do like to kind of collect different showcase frames throughout the last few years of Magic. These are really pretty even by showcase standards. And the other benefit is that they are clearly creature lands from the opponent's side of the battlefield. You'll never...
Yeah, they don't look like forests or whatever.
Exactly. You'll never look at a lair of the Hydra and attack into it unknowingly. Although you might with a card like Celestial Colonnade, which kind of looks like a hallowed fountain from across the table.
Yeah, specifically the showcase version of the ones that are done in the D&D showbook style.
Yeah, those are the ones I play, and they're reasonably affordable. So yeah, it was a good choice for me. I'll just also mention that I think my favorite of the five is now Hive of the Eye Tyrant, although I have run all five at different points in time. Okay, my number 4 most overlooked or undervalued card is Priest of Fell Rites from Modern Horizons 2. I think I was correct on the power level of this card. It's fine in a fair environment like my own where I'm not reanimating things. It's fine. I will play it. It will synergize with things in Mardu decks. I can discard a card to Faithless Looting and then immediately reanimate it with the Priest, depending on what turn of the game it is. So
this is the Burial Rites on a stick, basically, the black, white, gold card.
Yes, that's correct. And it will also unearth itself, and then you can either reanimate another thing or do the usual unearth attacking thing.
Yeah.
What I underestimated about this card is how modular and unique the deck building incentives are here. And this was really sparked for me when I played a game or a cube draft of my friend Insco's cube, another Philadelphia area cube curator. And this was the centerpiece of my deck. I was looping it with Volrath Stronghold, I think, which was kind of busted.
Rude, TBH.
Yeah, and I loved that so much because Priest let me identify the best card in my deck for that situation. Sometimes it was Cathar Commando, sometimes it was Thalia, and it let me reuse those cards. Actually, Skyclave Apparition also featured heavily in that. I blew up
buddy.
most of my opponent's permanents with Skyclave Apparition, Volrath Stronghold, and Priest of Felright. But anyways, I just love the moments of discovery and creativity and emergent coolness that happens with this Priest. So I like it a lot. It's at the lower end of my main cube's power band, but it's one of those cards where I'm maybe I should design a cube entirely for it to make it shine in the way that I know that it can now. And so I really like that. Yeah,
it's a very cool design, a very elegant way to use Unearth in combination with a pretty intuitive activated ability that also calls back to an iconic card. I think it's a very neat little package.
All right, in third place is a card whose power level I misjudged, and that is Rakdos Headliner from Modern Horizons 2. This is the 3/3 haste that has an echo cost of discarding a card. But here's the thing, it only costs red-black to cast the first time, and it has haste. I have won games in my format where Rakdos Headliner is the only creature I play and attack with. It's just hard to overstate how much damage this represents and how minimal the downside of the echo cost can be in a format with Lingering Souls or Delve or Croxa or,
Luris.
Just name a card that synergizes with the graveyard, and it will turn Rakdos Headliner into a card with very little downside.
It's also obviously great in the context if you have themes like Madness, where you can really get a lot of value out of it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So this is a card that is a lot more powerful than I thought it would be. And even well into the late game, the 3/3 body really, it scales fine in my format. It will still rumble with other Watchwolf kinds of effects. It will double block a Tarmogoyf pretty easily. Yeah, it's just a lot stronger than I thought it would be. And I actually think you would like it, Andy, because it is very proactive and tempo heavy.
I have played it in listener of the show and friend of the show, Scott Mertz's Cube, and I combined it with Luris and did some disgusting things where I would just, discard whatever to its activated ability, then cast that thing with Luris, and it was a lot of fun. I think it would be totally fine and well within my my design goals for the Bun Magic Cube. There's so many great red, black, gold cards, and I'm a big advocate for uneven gold sections, and I do indeed have a much deeper red, black, gold section than most other color combinations, but I don't know if I have enough space for one more. It's hard to squeeze it in there.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, in second place, I have Lelia, the Blade Reforged from Commander 21, which I did not test. I did not submit a survey for Commander 21. As it turns out, I love Lelia. She is very strong, but not overpowered in my cube in the same way that, Andy, I think you may have mentioned that you found her to be a little too strong. Is that correct?
I've been on a journey with this one. When it first was spoiled and we talked about it during the Set Perspective episode, I think, I was at the time feeling like, yeah, this is probably too pushed. I'm going to put it in there, and I'm sure it's going to be the kind of card that, ruins people's days, and it'll be cut the same way that Oko and whatever was cut after not too long in the cube. And it didn't turn out to be. It turned out to be, I think, totally fine. It's about the right power level for a red 3-drop in my environment. I like it a lot more in terms of play patterns than your Goblin Rabble Masters of the world. We did a whole episode. The title of the episode, I think, is Something and Ragavan and Lelia, because I was talking about how I am more likely to want to play Power Outliers at 1 mana like Ragavan than Power Outliers higher up on the curve like Lelia. But as it turns out, Lelia was a really bad example of that concept, because I actually think the card is totally fine in my environment, and, as most 3-drops should, most of the time eats a removal spell, very often before it even draws you the first card. But a 3-drop that demands an answer is where I need my 3-drops to be.
Yeah, I feel much the same way. In my format, like, the first attack isn't always guaranteed because, again, my creature sizing is based around that 2-mana 3/3 Watchwolf.
Or even if first attack is guaranteed, you're not getting the card also unless you have played it at least on turn 4, so you can maybe hit a land drop off the top, or you get super lucky and flip a Gitaxian Probe or something. But you play this on curve, your first attack, it is just, it's worse than Rakdos Headliner, which only costs 2 mana and attacks for the same power and toughness a turn earlier,
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are some really, nice backstops against Lelia being consistently dominant, but it has enough story moments and enough, cool equity to make her really a fun power outlier in my format. Fun, but not overpowered.
That's where I landed on her, too. I think she's totally fine and, a high pick in red decks, but not the highest pick in red decks. There's plenty of red cards I would take over Lelia. I think a card ended up being kind of a nice fit for my environment.
And then my most overlooked card from this time period is Urza's Saga from Modern Horizons. I did not test this either, apparently. And I'm thinking back, and I'm sure I thought it was powerful because I was listening to Dominaria's Judgment, and they were like, this card's going to be great. And I was like, hey, I trust Dominari, and I was also seeing everywhere that the card was powerful. maybe this is just hindsight bias talking, and that's why we didn't do a quote unquote like retrospective survey, because we knew there would be a bunch of hindsight bias. But like, I'm sure I was testing this, but actually, in fact, I was not.
It's funny, like, so oftentimes my week 3 perception is what I remember as my actual perception. Like, I did not expect Murktide region was going to be rated a 1, because I turned around on that real quick.
Yeah.
But I turned around on it like in week 2 or week 3. I did not turn around on it at the literal spoiling, which is exactly why we do the perspective when we do it, because my first read of that card was like, dragon. And then I got to play with it because, again, it was in my pre-release pool, and pretty immediately I was like, oh, dragon. I like this. That's the thing. It's so easy to remember. I was surprised to see a 1 next to it on my survey, and then I was like, well, actually, thinking back, I do remember that, my very first impression was different than my, second impression, which is easy to remember as your first impression.
Yeah, and as it turns out, I adore playing with Urza's Saga. It's got that open-ended incentive structure where, like, sometimes you will want to find Scrabbling Claws with the 3rd chapter, and sometimes you will want to play it even if you can't fetch anything. And then other times you've got the really busted deck that's like built around Urza's Saga, Mishra's Bauble, Shadow Spear, etc. And that's just a really fun, open-ended, and combat-centric suite of abilities and effects that really makes it... I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that this is one of the pillars of my cube at the moment.
Big statement for a card that wasn't even on the testing list, but
I know.
I'm in the same spot, right?
Yeah.
I had so many cards that weren't on my list, and I'm like, this is actually one of my favorite cards in this color right now.
Yeah, it's funny, Urza Saga in particular has gone up with players that respond to the survey, but down with Cube Cobra overall. So it's interesting to look at these cards where we see a little bit more of the bias of people that are submitting to the surveys.
Oh, yeah. I think the people who respond to our set surveys, compared to the average Cube Cobra user, are much friendlier to power outliers or like constructed all-stars, I guess you could say. They're much friendlier to those. They're much friendlier to the polarizing play patterns of cards like Oko or Ragavan. They may also have a higher budget than the average Cube Cobra user because they're testing Ragavan at much higher rates than the average Cube Cobra person.
Yeah.
So those are, I think, all significant, Anthony.
And I guess it's important to note for people listening that we obviously don't have all of Cube Cobra data for the perspective, because all of Cube Cobra didn't fill it out. That was data we don't have access to. It's why we do the whole survey in the first place, because trying to measure play rate on Cube Cobra at a card's inception is not really possible, because some people update their cube immediately, some people update their cube 6 months later, even though they intended to add the card when it came out. They just only update their cube every once in a while. And some people, by the time other people have updated it for the first time, have already tested the card and cut it again because they, changed their mind about it. And so if we're trying to capture initial impressions, we can't do that from Cube Cobra data. So when we say that the play rate has changed across all of Cube Cobra, we're comparing the rate amongst our prospective respondents to the current play rate across all of Cube Cobra versus comparing it to the current play rate of people that responded to our survey and gave us their Cube Cobra link, so we can actually go look and see if their list currently has the card still in it.
And in case that was really confusing for you, it's also in
Check out the
written
article.
form at the article. Yeah.
All right, Anthony, time to come clean. What
So-
did you underrate?
It's been mentioned a couple times already, but the first thing I want to mention is Clarion Spirit. I was pretty low on this card, and I think it's mostly because it's just a little bit polarizing. I wasn't sure either if it was just going to be way overpowered or if it wasn't actually, a low curving enough environment where this was going to be really relevant. But it turns out I think this card doesn't play out too busted. It's definitely one of the cards I take highly in the environment. But more than anything else, it's just something that I really enjoy playing with. I think it really encourages players to, draft and use mana sinks and play in a certain way. And I love making little flyers.
I can see the little smirk on Parker's face, because this is exactly what he
yes.
said in his hot take, that
Yes.
double spelling is already fun, and so rewarding people for double spelling is a great incentive structure to make the card actually fun to play with. We talked about this card on our episode where we went over all the cards that are in both the Bun Magic and regular cube, because it's a great card for scaling with power level. You don't get to double spell every single turn after you cast your Clarion Spirit in your cube like you
Right.
pretty much do in mine, which means that you're not getting quite as much value off of it, which is appropriate scaling for the power level of the environment.
And flying is really good, and it ends games.
Flying good. Hot take.
I feel like I'm just talking about white 2-drops here, but that's where we are. So the next up I have Thunderous Order. This is another one where I was just a little bit skeptical. It was just pretty wordy. It requires you to think about cards in kind of a weird way. But again, I just find that the play patterns work pretty well. It usually just cares about getting flying, but that's something that is really relevant to the white decks in this context having reach. It's funny how I'm putting Thunderous Order in the underrated category and Fearless Fledgling in the overrated category, but I think a lot of that's more just that these are converging, and I just started in very different places with my initial evaluations of them.
I remember you being somewhat high on Thunderous Order
I was
in
somewhat
our
high, but
episode.
I
What was your
might have-
rating of it?
So I gave it a 1.6, so a little
that
bit
is
above
low, yeah.
average. So I was skeptical. Another one I was skeptical about, but I just really liked the card, and it turns out has been really impactful, is Nested Shambler. So this is just the 1-mana 1/1 that dies, makes a squirrel, potentially more squirrels if you have a little way to build around it. I think that this has been overperforming just because it fits into decks that are a little bit over-supported right now.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
But I
Context matters,
still
my guy.
just enjoy making squirrels, so I think my esteem of this card has risen.
Are squirrels better than saplings?
No, saplings are a little bit better than squirrels, but thank you for
sure?
asking.
Very important question.
I feel like a squirrel would eat fungus.
Until the squirrel dies, and then the fungus eats the squirrel. It's a beautiful
Oh,
circle of tokens.
okay. Touche.
Life.
Speaking of the Circle of Life, another card that I've gotten much higher on lately is Graceful Restoration. So this is the 5-mana Reanimate, or you reanimate 2 small things. This is a card that has similarly just been sort of a big signpost card. It's really pulled people into this kind of
Signpost of creatures in your
signpost
deck.
of have lots of small creatures. Yeah, I think it's actually just very powerful and fits into pretty much any deck, but really gets rewarded when you have lots of small things and token generators and enter the battlefield effect. So I really just enjoy playing with this card, although it potentially is a little bit overpowered, but we'll just see how it goes.
Its second mode is definitely the main mode in your cube, in my opinion. I
think so.
can't imagine being happy to return one thing. I feel like that's just a fail case for me in that environment. Then again,
Especially
I tend
in
to draft
those
especially
colors in
low curving
particular.
decks. That's my personal preference in Magic, so other players might have different experiences with it.
But I think that's actually one of the things I like about this card is it has the potential, if you're playing, a green-black deck, you could splash for this. And
I was
then
going to say,
get
it's
something
such a
that
good
big.
splash card because it is only one of each color commitment, and it is a card you explicitly want to play quite late in the game.
That's what I was going to ask. Are you playing like Eternal Witness or Archaeomancer or anything that can loop with this?
There is a Shipwreck Dowser, so there are a couple potential loops there. It's been a very long time in this environment that's, as the curve has come down, it's gotten a little bit faster. It's been a long time since I've seen anybody try to go for those loops or succeed in those kinds of loops, but it's definitely theoretically possible.
Yeah, I guess what that means to me in terms of the power level is that this is like a one-time burst of power, and I think that means a lot because unlike a card like Soul Herder or something, which is gaining incremental value turn after turn with token generators, you can still kind of deal with Graceful Restoration's rate and its effect by outgrinding it or whatever, whereas it's harder to do that if it's getting looped.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last card I have here is Access Tunnels. This is a land that gives small creatures unblockable. This, again, is something that I was just really, really skeptical of. I like lands that do stuff and have effects, these kind of utility lands. I didn't think this was really going to perform that well, but it turns out it plays pretty okay. Not every deck wants it, but some do, and it gives decks reach, while being a little bit less polarizing than something like Rogue's Passage, which can just let a huge threat win immediately. So this card, I think, is going to stick around for a little while.
Huh. I don't think I've seen this one played. I've not been part of a game where this was played in your cube, and I would have been... I maintain my skepticism that you had previously. Maybe I have to learn my lesson the same way you have.
It's definitely, not a high pick. I wouldn't say I see it played every draft, but enough other people have played and enjoyed with it. I mean, that's a big part of how my evaluations have changed of these cards is when I see other people playing things
course,
and saying,
yeah.
I'm enjoying playing with this, and it's being effective with this particular context. So yeah, this one surprised me a little bit.
I feel like there's a lot of decks in your cube that if you gave it to me for free, I wouldn't put it in at the end, but maybe I'm wrong. I've been wrong a lot before, as this episode has covered in great detail. So
Give it a try next time.
All right, we've talked enough about how wrong we are, and this episode's gone quite long, but I think people will be excited about that. Let's end with a little lightning round of cards that we were right about. Just brag a little bit so people don't just stop listening to the show because we're such bad Magic players that don't know what we like or dislike. I got a relatively short list here. I mean, there's a lot of cards I was right about, but everyone else was also kind of right about. So the ones I really want to call out I'm very proud of my evaluation of Esper Sentinel. This is a card that a lot of people were testing. The community was somewhat high on this card from Modern Horizons 2, but a lot of other people were very prominent in their decrying of this card and saying that you can't put one-powered aggressive cards in your aggro deck that is like a non-starter. A card has to be a Savannah Alliance to be playable. And I mean, there's so many games where you're playing a control deck, your opening hand has like a disfigure and a counterspell and a 4-mana planeswalker, and you're like, this is great, I can't lose. And then they play a turn 1 Esper Sentinel, and you're like, crap, I guess I now either have to let them draw a card, or I have to spend the turn I wanted to hold up Counterspell, casting Disfigure for 2, and they get a mana advantage and also take me off my Counterspell. And those little kinds of disruptions are like hugely annoying. And this is even in my environment where I don't have anything resembling an Artifact Matters theme. If you got a lot of artifacts floating around and you care about this thing's type line, or you're giving this thing equipment to increase its power, then it gets even more relevant. So proud of my rating of that card. I think if you went back and listened to what I said about it in spoiler season, you'd find that I still feel the same way and think I was right about it. I think everyone on this call was probably right about Prismatic Ending, but a lot of people weren't. A lot of people thought that card was not that good and have since been proven wrong by Constructed Performance. This is a card that has seen an increased community play rate, so one of the cards people have come around on a little bit, and just a great example of, I think you first look at it and you're like, well, scaling removal seems fine, but to me, the floor is what's so good here. The fact that it's a 1-mana spell to get rid of any 1-mana permanent, or a 2-mana spell to get rid of any 2-mana permanent, like that's a really good baseline for me. And then the sort of gravy of playing a 3 or 4 color deck and getting to remove something big is pure upside. I'm happy to just be able to get rid of something small for very little mana in the early game, which is actually comes down to why I like this card so much more than what's the new Domain Oblivion Ring?
Leyline Binding.
Thank you. Is why I like this card so much more than Leyline Binding, which is not good at getting rid of small things. It's good at getting rid of everything.
Right.
And the thing that changes is how much mana you pay for it. I'd much rather always pay a little mana and have more variability in what I can get rid of than be able to always get rid of things but have that amount of mana I'm paying be variable. So that's a card I'm proud of. This one is a little bit different than the others. I'm really proud of how I rated Witherbloom Command, which is a card that people did not rate very highly and are still not rating very highly. People are not playing this card, but I looked at it and thought it was a good fit for my environment. I put it in the cube initially. I was met by enough people when I was posting this thing online, talking about my cube, asking like, why are you playing Witherbloom Command? Get that out of here. I'd post a deck list and they'd say, well, obviously you cut Witherbloom Command. Maybe you sided in, but that's not a main deckable card. And I got like bullied into taking it out. And then we did our deep dive on the like specific interactions of limited removal in our environments, Anthony, and I looked at the Bun Magic Cube and was like, -1 toughness kills so much. It is so relevant, and there are also so many other cheap non-creature permanents that the other mode can get rid of, that this card I think is just good. I put it back in, and it's been a delight, a joy to play with. The self-mill mode is fantastic. Buying back a land is fantastic. Oftentimes, you get a clean 2-for-1 for 2 mana to instant speed. You can kill a creature, you can kill their equipment, you can kill their whatever, even kill their clue token when they're tapped out and don't have a chance to crack it. It's just been great. This card, I don't know if it's right for everyone listening. I'm not here to like preach the gospel of Witherbloom Command, but I was right for me when I reviewed the card for my own setting, and should have just stuck by that instead of allowing myself to get bullied by people telling me that this card didn't fit in my environment.
Don't listen to bullies.
It's true. And number 1 is Unholy Heat. This card I called from the beginning, along with, I think, Parker and maybe you as well, Anthony. This card was going to be messed up. It's a 1-mana Hero's Downfall in red, and this is a card that's seen a huge increased play rate, was really only tested by 7.4% of our respondents, which is crazy low, and its subsequent high performance in Constructed has brought it to the 4, and way more people are playing it now. I could tell from when that card was spoiled that it was going to be messed up, and I'm proud to have been on it since the beginning.
And Delirium is a cool mechanic that I feel like we've seen more and more support for and more people are interested in.
I will say, I think it's my favorite of the threshold style mechanics, but I don't think it's a cool mechanic personally. I think it's a little bit accounting-y. It's not my favorite kind of thing.
Most incredulous what from Parker?
I was going to add, like, I just listened to the Scourge episode of the Resleevables because they're on hiatus, and so I just listened to them over and over.
Indefinite hiatus.
Yeah. I just like restart the series every time I reach the end. But I was listening to the Scourge one, and they made a really good point about Threshold and Delirium, which is that like Delirium operates in different ways depending on the color that it's on. Like,
Oh, it's
red
way
is-
better than Threshold. I like the mechanic a lot more
Oh,
than
yeah.
Threshold, for sure.
It's really open-ended in that way. Like, red might want to use artifacts and lands or sorceries in the graveyard in order to reach Delirium, but green can say, I'm just going to use the raw self-mill power of, whatever cards are in the format, Satyr Wayfinder or something, to reach Delirium just through, like, raw number of cards milled. So I think it's a really cool design that inspires divergent deck-building choices, I guess.
Yeah, I like it a lot more than Threshold, but like if you compare it to other things like when you cast your second spell a turn, or even like Delve, I think I prefer Delve to this because it doesn't require as much like fiddly accounting of like exactly how many types do I have. I gotta like count every time I add a new spell to the yard. It's better than Threshold, but still not my favorite mechanic overall. But I do love Unholy Heat and I love Dragon Ray's Channeler, and both those cards led me to include more types in the Graveyard Matter cards because I liked them enough that I wanted the Delirium thing to not be so isolated. So I put in Jurassic Wald, I put in Tarmogoyf, cards that care about these things otherwise, so that it's an aspect of the game that players are paying attention to because it's on multiple cards across the environment.
Yeah, and I feel like the complexity of tracking your graveyard during the game is maybe a downside, but it's enabling a lot of really fun decisions during draft and deck build, which
it does do that. It makes
we
you
might not pay
evaluate
enough
cards
attention
way
to.
differently in drafting
Yeah.
and deck building, which that's an advantage of the card. I think if I was playing digitally and it just happened automatically, I would like it a lot more. It's the accounting
Sure.
aspect of like checking for Delirium that really kind of bums me out.
All right, so my called shots, I guess, begin with Abundant Harvest. So this is a card, I think there was some noise about this like during preview season. People did perceive that it was powerful, but I really want to talk about how perfect it ended up being for my design goals. I love that the fail state on this card, or like the fail state on a cantrip in general, is when you need a land on turn 2 and you draw a spell. And Abundant Harvest completely mitigates that downside with 100% certainty. And it's not very often that we get something that's truly 100% certain in Magic, but something that is certain is that Abundant Harvest will not draw you a spell if you are mana screwed. And I love alleviating that portion of like the game engine.
Yeah, I really like this card as well. I have this on my list as well. Compared to things like Adventurous Impulse that have that fail case that feels so bad, I really like that this is always going to give you what you need in terms of land or spell. I also just really like it being a callback to an old classic card.
Oh yeah, that's true. It's nostalgic. It has beautiful art itself. Yeah, it's the whole package for me, and I'm really pleased that I'm aware of these own preferences of mine, I guess.
It's also worth noting that I really like that it is a guaranteed thing in one axis, but it is not the kind of guaranteed thing that leads to very repetitive games, right? Like Demonic Tutor also always draws you a land when you need a land and a spell when you need a spell, but it also kind of has the risk of doing the same thing over and over again. This still leans into the inherent variance at the top of your deck. You don't have to shuffle, which is great. I agree. This is like a perfect card, and I'm right with you on it. Fantastic.
Another difference might be, or like another comparison could be Luris. Like you get a guaranteed 8th card, but gameplay kind of degenerates.
You know, we've been recording for a while when you're like, you know what's similar to Abundant Harvest? Luris.
Hey,
we're deep in the sauce at this point.
They both alleviate certain constraints in the game engine at a fundamental level. My other correctly called shot or the second of my correctly called shots is Luminarch Aspirant. This is another one.
Rub it in a little bit. Just rub it in.
I certainly will. I knew it was going to be powerful, or I think, like, I rated it a 2.9, so I was fairly certain that it was powerful, but also that it would fit my design goals. And Andy, you've already done a good job of talking about how great this card is. I agree with everything you said. I think it leads to really fun decisions, but you can also opt out of those decisions if you're a newer player or if you're at your complexity threshold. Then you can just like stack the counters wherever without really caring about it, and it'll always work out well. So yeah, I really like it. And then my other or last called shot is Unholy Heat also.
Yeah, buddy.
I think so many people missed this in Cube specifically because it was spoiled on the last day of the preview season for Modern Horizons 2, and it was just in that unceremonious dump of commons that happens on the last day.
Which is wild, because I have to imagine that R&D knew this was going to be a very relevant card to construct it. Like, they couldn't have missed that, right?
I don't know. But whatever the case,
I think preview season is more about splashy things that are going to get people's attention and interest, not so much necessarily exactly what are going to be the key features of constructed format.
I feel like their goal is to like give all the cards that are going to play in any format a spotlight, and then the stuff that has to be in the set because limited needs to function is the kind of stuff that ends up spoiled on the last day.
So maybe like WotC undervalued Unholy Heat. But whatever the case, on the day it was spoiled, remember thinking, oh, this is like Fatal Push, except you're trading the Revolt trade-off with a Delirium trade-off, and also it hits things that sometimes cost 6 mana.
And it kills Planeswalkers.
And Planeswalkers.
It's kind of like Lurrus in a way, if you think about it.
If you think about it, it is a little bit like Lurrus. Yeah, so the card has been very strong. It, along with Fury, has like revolutionized red decks in Modern, and has really like put massive constraints on what threats are playable in that format. It doesn't do the same thing in Cube because there's only one of them if you're running Singleton, but like we talked about earlier, I love the play patterns as well, not just the power level. So it's been a perfect card for me that I was also correct about the power level.
It's funny you bring up Fury, because I think this card also suffered from the I can't do damage to my opponent's face, like, groan.
It did. It absolutely did. Yeah.
Which, I think I feel confident in saying that I have not fallen for that trap, at least in these particular sets we're talking about. So I would encourage you, listener, to also not fall for that trap, because Fury is cracked and Unholy Heat is cracked, and it doesn't matter that they're not Lightning Bolt. There are plenty of situations in my cube where I will take Unholy Heat over Lightning Bolt. That has come up more times than you might expect, because as we talked about in the removal breakdown episode, Lightning Bolt doesn't kill that much more than an Undelirium Unholy Heat does, and the Delirium upside is oftentimes way better than the 1 more damage upside or the going to your opponent's face upside, depending on your deck.
The other thought I had when on the day that this released, it just occurred to me as I was thinking through this thought experiment. I thought to myself, Unholy Heat can kill Oko Thief of Crowns after a +2.
The only card in all of Magic that can do that. I mean, show me another card. I don't think another card's ever been printed that can do that.
And it can do so at a tempo advantage for 1 mana, right? And I remember it so specifically because I was going to submit a hot take to the Perspective episode, because this was before I was joining for those. But I didn't. I thought about it really hard. I even practiced what I would say, didn't submit. And so, listener, this is your...
And now we just have to take your word for it. We don't have any evidence that you actually felt this way.
So if you want proof, dear listener, then submit a hot take.
I actually made an intentional point to tweet during spoiler season, gosh, a lot of people sure are low on 1 mana Hero's Downfall in red, because I wanted to be able to point back to that tweet because I knew people were gonna not take this card very seriously. Nice. All right, Anthony, bragging is not something that comes natural to you, but it's time for you to tell us what you were right about.
So I'm still very happy with Abundant Harvest, as we already mentioned. Next, after that, Frost Trickster. I knew right away that this was going to be the perfect regular card.
That did jump out to me as a regular cube card. I saw it and I was like, that's a regular cube card.
Compare it to Chrome Courier, the two power really matters, but it's not slowing down the game. In fact, it's speeding up the game, and if you do have loops with Soul Herder or something, again, it's actually letting you push through and have a gameplay that's going to bring the game to some sort of conclusion. So, perfect regular card.
I gotta say, one of my early level ups, I think, in Magic Theory was thinking my first impression of something like a Frostlynx was, this is just worse than Mana War. Obviously, I want to bounce my opponent's thing so that they have to replay it. That's better than just tapping it down. And actually, there are so many situations where you'd much rather just tap it down. I mean, the obvious one is if it has Enter the Battlefield ability.
Right.
Then you don't want to bounce it and let them re-trigger that. But even absent that, if you bounce it back to their hand, they're going to have the mana to cast a raid again. You're only going to clear that blocker for 1 turn,
right,
whereas your Frostlynx or whatever, or your Frost Trickster, or your Core Hookmaster is going to clear that blocker for 2 turns, which is twice as many turns as the Mana War, which is oftentimes going to be just a better effect. And so that's a great example of the thing I think Cube designers should be very conscious of, is does your environment want the Mana War, or does it want the Frost Trickster, or does it want both, like Anthony's Cube?
Next up, we got Barb Spike. I've been loving all these little equipment/creatures, finding more ways to get equipment in the cube, and flying continues to be good.
How do you feel about reconfigure relative to Barb Spike?
I like reconfigure quite a bit. I mean, I feel like they do a similar role, so I don't know that I would evaluate one or the other in too much of a direction. I would just say that if you have a cube that is interested in one of those kinds of effects, you probably want both of them.
No, I was just wondering because like the rules are slightly different when it comes to...
That is true. That's definitely a negative for me. I don't have anything in my environment that specifically cares about equipment, like discounting the equip cost or things like that, but that's definitely a small negative, just that it is a slightly different mechanic. So I finally have managed to actually make people play combat tricks, I think, with Snakeskin Veil. This is a card that some people maybe find a little bit annoying with the hexproof, but
really good.
It's quite solid and it just makes a lot of things work. So I was happy to include that, and I'm still happy with it. All right, and then last up, perfect regular card, Captured by Legax. You might remember I was thinking a little bit about cutting it just because it's kind of overpowered, but you told me not to. So from the perspective of the cube, it's stuck.
I think it is the... Like, I will probably include it in my like top 20 cards that matter in the regular cube. I think it's like up there. To me, it's the exact right power level for a gold card. Like compared to Chrome Courier, you pull me to gold I get like this like basically no payoff for it. I'm playing just Cloud Conceer at home, even though I'm in 2 colors. This is so much better than what you can do at 3 mana in green or white alone in your environment, and that's exactly where I want a gold card to be. And it's just such a dynamic game piece where you can put those counters on other things. You do have to draft the right kind of deck. Like if you're playing some Bant control deck, you're not... Well, you might still splash this, but you're not getting anywhere near the same value of splashing this as you are if you're playing an actual green-white deck with cheap creatures to beat down. I think it's a perfect card for the regular cube. And if it doesn't belong in the regular cube, then I don't know what the regular cube is, man.
Yeah, and that's the most compelling point.
All right, well, this was... I mean, we prepared to go a little long. This is a little longer than I even expected, but I hope people enjoyed this episode because, these are going to be less common than the set perspective episodes. We'll do these, I guess, once a year if people liked it, but I think this is a great opportunity for you to look back on your own ratings if you've been filling out our perspectives, because it is a good chance for you to figure out your own biases and evaluation habits so you can get better at your own personal card evaluation skills. All the data from those surveys is downloadable, so if you haven't saved your responses separately, you can get it from our website. And just a reminder that you should be filling out the perspectives if you're not, because you don't get to learn from these past things if you are not being honest with yourself and actually documenting that for the future. So if you're designing a cube out there and you've not been responding to our perspective surveys, Anthony has spent so much time making it as easy as possible for you. Just paste your Cube Cobra link. It pulls things automatically in. Nice little interface for rating things. It's as easy as could be. And I look forward to it just as my own... Like, I actually evaluate the cards for the first time on our own website because I think it's one of the best places to do it, to actually like put those ratings in paper. So you should be doing that, people. All right, without any further talking, we're just going to end this episode now. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We do appreciate it. All our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and Parker and I digging through the archives of our past survey ratings, looking at them with red-hot embarrassment on our face, and then coming clean to you all listeners about the things we are wrong about. Thanks for participating in this journey of self-improvement, Parker and Anthony.
Thanks for having
me.
me.
I'm not too embarrassed. I feel like I got it pretty much right.
You two are like so good at waiting exactly the right amount of time for the other person to start talking, and then talking at the same time no matter what.
It's our special power.
It's very good.
I feel like that meme where the woman is at the confessional and she's telling the priest something, and the priest is like, please stop. And that's what happened this episode, because we confessed our card evaluation sins for 2 hours.
Yeah, so if you haven't unsubscribed because you're like, these guys are idiots, then I guess go give us a 5 stars on iTunes. I don't know. If you're still here, you must like us. Hey, are you Hillary?
Yeah, Andy?
Yeah, I think I'm your round 2 opponent.
Oh, cool. Don't you have a podcast?
So, I think you should be like, are you the guy with that podcast, right? Like there's a...
Like, not cool.
Yeah, pretend it's not cool. It's pretend. Just pretend it's not cool. I know you know it's very cool, but pretend just for a minute
That
just
it's
for
not
fun,
cool.
that it's not very cool to have a podcast about Magic the Gathering.
But I'm playing you.
No, so here's the vibe.
Okay.
The vibe is like, oh, you've heard that at this store somebody plays that has a podcast. You've like heard through the thing.
Ryan, and I hate podcasts.
Well, okay, no, I don't think that's the vibe. I don't understand why that's what we're going for here. So that's the you've heard that. That was good. A little quiet.
Okay. Let's try
You
again.
can also just get a little closer to the microphone.
Like this? Is this too close?
No, you can't be too close. This thing keeps you from
Is this
being too
really?
close.
Is it? Should I just talk like this?
If you want to, yeah.
It makes me kind of muffled though. Okay.
Let's do another take.
Okay.
Hey, you Hillary?
Yep.
I think I am your round 2 opponent.
Oh, so you're Andy?
Why'd you say it like that? Be normal at this point.
Oh, sorry. Okay, let's do it
Like,
again.
you must be Andy then. You've
you
seen
must
in
be-
your app
Yeah.
that your round 2 opponent is Andy.
Clearly,
but
I don't-
But you've
I-
never met me.
Yeah.
And so,
clearly I'm rusty with what it looks like in the app when
so
I
when
see my
I say I'm
opponent.
your round 2 opponent, then you know, oh, this must be Andy, who I saw in
Oh,
the app.
you must be Andy.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh,
Much
you must
better.
be Andy.
Yeah, so good.
Okay.
So good and so natural. Hey, are you Hillary?
Yep. You told me to say yep first.
Yeah, you sounded kind of annoyed. You were like, yep. Yep.
Okay. Why don't you just delete all this?
Because we might need it for later.
Okay.